I'm ready, Zorian said. You can start casting whenever you want. Estin, his current practice partner, gave him a solemn nod and started launching magic missiles at him in quick succession. Zorian calmly intercepted them all with his shield, dividing his attention between watching the way Estin was casting the spell so he could help him improve it afterwards and trying to work out the absolute minimum shield strength he could get away with to safely tank the attacks. A bad idea usually if this had been a real spar, like the ones he had been having with Taven recently, being as cheap as possible with his counters would be a recipe for disaster. But well, his practice group had pretty much given up on those when he was involved. He was too good and didn't know how to hold back properly, so these days he mostly served as a living target and dispenser of advice. Not that this made him useless to the group, far from it, but it did mean he had to get creative to get some personal benefit from attending these practice sessions. After 14 magic missiles, Estin stopped casting and they switched positions, with Estin defending himself and Zorian attacking. The former Ebasin was the only person in the training group who could really tank one of his magic missiles at maximum power, so there was no need for Zorian to hold back. The floating earth spheres Estin used as shields were far more resilient than he initially gave them credit for, soaking up his magic missiles with ease. No matter what he tried, he could not even shatter one, much less punch through them. It was an interesting challenge. He had largely reached a plateau in terms of magic missile strength. Like all spells, magic missile had a limited amount of mana it could be supercharged with, and Zorian was at the point where he simply couldn't cram in more mana without hopelessly destabilizing the spell boundary. That was a shame, as magic missile was his most energy-efficient combat spell, thanks to the amount of practice he put into it. In fact, the spell was so mana-efficient at this point that it was playing merry hell with his ability to judge how far his mana reserves had grown. He could cast about 35 of them in quick succession, which was more than 4 times the amount he could cast before the time loop. That shouldn't be possible, especially since he was sure his mana reserve still hadn't topped out yet, so the most logical conclusion was that his magic missiles required significantly less mana now than they had in the past. The magnitude system probably wasn't designed with people like him in mind. He doubted a lot of people practiced magic missile as doggedly as he did. And yet, for all the refinement his magic missile now had, he knew from Kiran that he still hadn't reached the pinnacle of the spell. A properly executed magic missile would be totally invisible. Which his magic missiles weren't. He had an idea about that, though. No one in the practice group other than Estin could reliably tank one of his magic missiles without their shields giving way. Even his normal missiles often proved too much for them, never mind if he really powered them up. As a consequence, he had been forced to learn how to adjust his attacks downwards to something they could deal with. He quickly found that trying to purposely weaken his missiles was pretty hard. Strategically sabotaging the spell boundary to make the spell less mana efficient was inelegant and offended his professional pride, but trying to make magic missile technically perfect yet functionally weaker was not as easy as it appeared at first glance. His reflexes, honed over the years spent in the time loop, and even the very construction of the spell itself naturally tended towards a certain optimum effect. Going against it was a constant struggle. Still, he had gotten the hang of the ability to dial down the missile's power after a few days, and had discovered that when he dialed the power low enough, he could get the shine and opacity to drop like a stone. At the very lowest point, he could produce missiles that were nothing but a faint warp in the air and sadly, about as effective on anything they hit. Still, practicing the spell at these lower power levels made it easier to see the faults and imperfections he made in the spell boundary, and fixing those immediately led to a small but noticeable increase in his mana efficiency when casting his normal version of magic missile. He had a feeling this was the secret to effectively developing proper invisible force spells. Don't start by making normal versions invisible, instead reduce the power and work on making a weaker version more technically perfect and mana efficient. Then steadily work your way up until you end up with a flawlessly executed, fully powered version. None of the books he'd found actually outlined this method as a possible training regimen, instead suggesting endless repetition of the spell as a method, but Zorian felt his idea had merit. He had little to lose by trying it, since the officially suggested training method consisted of mindlessly practicing the normal version for years and even decades at a time. Yes, he was stuck in a time loop, but there had to be a better method than that. After he'd failed to get through Estin's earth defense, he called for a brief pause to let everyone replenish their mana reserves. He personally didn't need the break. He was purposely using only a small fraction of his reserves during these practice sessions, and he had already honed his ability to assimilate ambient mana as far as it could go, so it generally took him only a few minutes to go back to his top form. The others needed to catch their breath, however, and he had to be mindful of that. If nothing else, he was learning the limitations of people around his age. He had honestly forgotten what it was like to be on their level, and had trouble judging what people his age found challenging or even downright impossible. Hopefully this experience would make him better equipped to pretend he was a normal student in the future, or at least more aware of what would attract people's attention and to what extent. The break was eventually interrupted when Edwin marched into the gathering, the latest golem they'd made following after him. "Hey Edwin," Naeem greeted. "What brings you here? Finally decided to join us?" "Ha, no. No, I'm here because of this," he said, grasping the little golem by its shoulders and proudly pushing it forward so the group could take a look at it. The construct was pretty impressive, even if Zorian was a little biased in thinking that. Being little less than a meter tall, the golem did not look particularly intimidating, but he doubted anyone would mistake it for a harmless toy. Its slender, humanoid figure was made out of alchemically treated steel and powered by a comparatively massive crystallized mana battery that supplied it with plenty of power. Its movements were smooth and natural, and despite Edwin's rough handling, it never lost its balance like Zorian's previous golems would have. The golem looked and moved like a credible little helper and last-ditch defender/distraction. They did a good job of making it, Zorian felt. Enlisting Edwin to help with his golem making had definitely been the right decision. "Neat," Naeem shrugged. "That's what you and Zorian have been working on all this time, isn't it? What about it?" "Yes," Zorian agreed. The last time they met, he left the golem with Edwin so the other boy could run a bunch of tests to see if it worked properly. Did Edwin find some critical flaw in the construct, or did he just come to brag about their success? "Is there something wrong with it?" Edwin asked with faux outrage. "His name is Kellic, and he's absolutely perfect. I mean, just look at him. Everyone, meet Kellic. Kellic, say hi to the nice folks gathered here." The golem quietly gave a brief wave before letting its metallic hand unceremoniously drop again. Yeah, apparently Edwin just wanted to brag. Zorian caught Estin and Capriva rolling their eyes at the spectacle, while Briam and Rainey seemed honestly impressed by the little golem. Naeem just continued smiling serenely, and Zorian couldn't tell whether Naeem was honestly happy for his friend or just humoring the guy. "Unfortunately, there was one part of him that I just couldn't test properly," Edwin said. "We warded this little beauty with every defensive ward we could manage." "Well, Zorian did, I just kind of watched and took notes. But never mind that, the point is that Kellic here should be able to shrug off a lot of damage and disruptive spells, and you want us to try and damage it," Estin surmised. "Yes," Edwin agreed with a grin. "I'll just move aside and then you can all just attack it together." "All of us?" Rainey asked curiously. "Yeah," Edwin nodded. "He's really tough, so don't worry about overkill. I don't think any of you can really do anything to it individually." Estin frowned, clearly taking that as a challenge, before putting one of his palms on the ground in front of him. For a second, nothing happened. And then, without any warning, the ground beneath Kellic opened up like a set of earthen jaws and pulled it into the resulting hole before snapping shut. The poor golem was left with most of its body trapped under the soil, with only its head sticking free. Edwin stared at the buried golem for a second before glancing uncertainly towards Estin. The other boy inclined his head to the side, smiling faintly, clearly very pleased with himself. "Okay. Claim disproven," Edwin chuckled awkwardly. Could you please unbury him so we can move on to further testing? Eventually, they did try to bring down the little golem with a collective magic missile barrage and predictably failed. Even Zorian's missiles did not damage Kellic in any way, though hitting the limbs and head could imbalance it and knock it to the ground. Estin tried to hammer it into scrap with one of his earth spheres, but only succeeded in knocking it to the ground and rendering it immobile so long as the sphere was pressing down on it. Capriva chucked a vial of alchemical acid at it, but this didn't work either. Finally, Brian went ahead and summoned his familiar and had the juvenile fire drake breathe fire at the golem for a while. That at least had some effect, in the sense that the golem ended up visibly heating up as a result. The fire wards weren't able to deal with sustained fire magic, it seemed. Edwin terminated the testing at this point, not wanting to see Kellic actually destroyed. A satisfactory result, all things considered. The vulnerability to being buried and otherwise restrained was a large and obvious weakness, though, and Zorian was already considering what he could do to overcome it when making golems in the future. The end of Edwin's golem test ultimately also signaled the end of the current practice session as well, and most people excused themselves and left afterwards. The summer festival was only a few days away, so this was basically the last training session he would have with the practice group. That fact left him strangely sad. He had originally resented the loss of free time that came with the meetings, but the classmates he taught had ended up growing on him a little. It was nice to have someone actually respect his skills and achievements for a change, instead of constantly reminding him about how inadequate he was and how far he still had to go. He turned towards Rainey, the last person to remain at the training ground with him. She didn't look like she intended to excuse herself, so he assumed she wanted to talk to him. Yes? He asked. Did you find out anything about your extra soul bits? She asked. She was stalling for time, but whatever. No reason not to answer the question. Sort of, he said. I found a few ways to interact with it, but I only know what one of them actually does. Or at least I think I do. I'll try it out soon to make sure. Yes, it was rather surprising, but apparently the marker actually was designed to be interacted with by its bearer. There were multiple switches, for lack of a better word, that were clearly meant to do something once they were activated. A good number of them were utterly inert, and did not react at all to his probing, either because he did not know how to interact with them properly or because they were broken in the marker's transfer from Zack to Zorian. A lot of them were perfectly functional, however, and readily responded to his probes, eager to be set off like exuberant little puppies. He shied away from actually experimenting with them, since they gave absolutely no indication what their function was. All except one. There was one command switch that immediately gave him a vague impression of what it was meant to do when he tried mucking around with it. He planned to test that one at the conclusion of his portal infiltration attempt. Make sure to have someone watching over you when you do that, Rainey cautioned. At the very least they can call for help if you collapse or something. I will, Zorian lied. Now why don't you tell me what's really bothering you? It's nothing you can really help me with, she sighed. I just feel like complaining to someone, I guess. I have no one here to confide to, except for Kiana. My fault, really. I didn't try very hard to make any other friends. I don't want to bother Kiana about this again, so. Well, feel free to complain, Zorian told her. Is this about your family, perhaps? Yes, she confirmed. I sent them a letter last week. Asked them if I could come home for the summer festival. They said I wasn't welcome. Well, not really in those words, but I can read between the lines. Harsh. What did she do to deserve that kind of response? Well, Rainey did say she wanted to complain, so he would probably find out soon. He opted to stay quiet and let her talk. After a moment of quiet while she collected her thoughts, she started her story. The leadership of my tribe is hereditary, she said. The firstborn son of the current chief inherits the mantle of leadership from his father. Simple enough, but the problem was that my father didn't have a son. My mother had a hard pregnancy when she bore me, and the tribe refused to bring outside healers to help. After I was born, she could conceive no further children. Or at least that's what we all thought for a time. Regardless, it was decided that in the absence of a male heir, even a daughter would do. Nobody wanted a succession crisis. So the tribe accepted a female leader but wasn't too happy with it. Considering the hypothetical scenario she'd asked him about earlier in the restart, he had a feeling he knew where this was going. As I grew up, I was constantly told I had to be strong for the tribe, Rainey said. That I have to work hard and embody the ideals we represented, so that there could be no question as to whether I deserved my position. I never resented that. I was proud of my tribesmen and my parents for putting so much faith in me. I did my best, and I was good at it. Good enough that, in time, even my staunchest critics had fallen silent. But then Mother got pregnant again. Zorian winced internally. It was a son, wasn't it? 9 months later, Mother gave birth to the baby boy that my father had always wanted, she said bitterly, confirming his suspicion. I wasn't sidelined immediately, of course. They had to make sure my brother was not defective in some way before doing something so rash. I had hoped for a time that I might succeed in keeping the mantle through superior skill and effort, but of course he ended up being a blasted prodigy. It was clear that he would eventually eclipse me. I did not take it very well. I did not step down from my position quietly, and some of the tribe members even supported me. Mostly because they felt I had proven myself capable while my brother was still a relative unknown, and the designated heir had never been stripped of their position like that, so the whole thing was a bit questionable. But ultimately, my worst enemy was my own father. I had thought he was proud of me, of all I had accomplished, but in the end he was the one arguing most vehemently that I should move aside so my brother can take the mantle. How could I have possibly won that battle when my own father stood against me? So they don't want you back because they think you're a threat to your brother's legitimacy and the tribe's leader? Zorian spoke out. I am a threat to his legitimacy, Rainey said. Was. I don't know. I'm not really sure about anything anymore. I feel like nothing I did mattered in the end. What do I even have to live for, now? All my life I was taught to live for the tribe, but I'm not sure I even want to go back there when they finally deign to let me return. What is there waiting for me? I don't think I'll ever be happy living back there. Zorian studied her for a moment, wondering if he should try and comfort her. She seemed more angry than sad, though, and he had a feeling she wouldn't appreciate such a gesture. Best not to risk it. So you being here is your exile, then? He asked. Pretty much, she answered. Me being here allows them to cement my brother's position without my interference. Plus, me being educated by outsiders and taught outsider magic destroys whatever shreds of legitimacy I had left. I can't understand why they won't let you home for the summer festival, then, Zorian said. Not that I understand why you'd even want to go back to your father and brother you clearly can't stand, but that's beside the point. The point is that if you've been outmaneuvered that thoroughly, surely there is no harm in letting you go back home for a few days. That seems very petty of them. They kept talking for a while. Well, Rainey kept talking, he mostly just listened, but eventually she ran out of steam and just fell quiet for a time before announcing it was late and that she should go. Before she left, however, she told him that she enjoyed their meetings and asked if they could continue meeting like that, even if his original purpose for approaching her had long been fulfilled at this point. He agreed. Of course he did. And despite her stoic demeanor, he could tell she was very happy to hear that. But the summer festival was just around the corner and she would soon forget any of this ever happened. The next time they met, they would be virtual strangers to each other. He decided not to befriend Rainey again in the future. Not while the time loop was still in effect, anyway. If he ever managed to get out, though, he told himself that he would try to befriend the red-headed shifter for real. She reminded him of his pre-time loop self too much to just ignore it. Her problem was, as she said, something he couldn't really help her with, but maybe just having an extra friend would be enough. He remained at the training ground for quite some time afterwards, lost in thought, before making his way back to Amaya's place. It was the day before the summer festival and everything was ready. He had stopped Nachka's kidnapping again, crafted all of the equipment he would be using in his gate-crashing attempt, and evacuated the filigree sages back to their home. Now all that was left was to gather the findings Kale and Taven had made with their personal research and store them inside his mind for future restarts. Here, Taven said, handing him a small notebook. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm kind of glad the month is coming to a close. You have no idea how annoying it is to practice shaping exercises all day, every day. Taven, I've had Svim as my mentor for the past 4 years. Zorian pointed out. Yeah, she waved dismissively. Show me what you've learned, he told her. What? But it's all written down there, she protested, pointing at the notebook in his hands. Doesn't matter, I want to see it personally, he insisted. Some things really cannot be written down. She had progressed nicely, he decided 15 minutes later. Some things he considered trivial didn't really work out, which meant he either wasn't teaching them properly or Taven was spectacularly unsuited for them, but there were also some exercises that came almost naturally to her. It was a good start, if nothing else. That was way too slow, he said. And you fumbled a bit towards the end. Start dash. If you say start over one more time, Zorian, Taven warned him. Fine, I'll stop channeling my inner Svim, he chuckled. We'll stop here. I got what I needed, I think. Kale, how about you? Are my eyes deceiving me, or has the amount of notebooks you got for me actually shrunk from what it was initially? You said you memorize how the whole book is made with that spell of yours, not just text, so I figured I would write as dense as possible and save space that way. A single book takes the same amount of space in your memory regardless of how much is written in it, if I understood you correctly, Kale said. That's true, but the alteration pattern I store is never flawless, so some imperfections are bound to creep up in the reproduction. I hope you didn't make the letters too small. Some quick testing proved that Kale's condensed writing survived the memorization reproduction process just fine, so Zorian went ahead and memorized the whole stack. Well, that's it, I guess, Taven said awkwardly. I guess we'll see each other in the next restart. Not that I'll remember any of it. Actually, I'm going to skip going to Scioria for a couple of restarts, Zorian admitted. I need to find a way to halt, or at least delay the degradation of the Matriarch's memory package. And also to advance my memory reading skills so I can get something out of it if I fail. I can't waste time on classes before I solve this. Fair enough, Kale said. I'll note that I have pretty much exhausted all the low-lying fruits when it comes to my research. I'll need to reach out to other experts and maybe acquire some restricted materials through less than legal channels the next time we do this. I know you're justifiably leery of making too many waves, so you'll have to discuss this with my other self. Just as well that he was putting his routine in Scioria on temporary hold, then. He didn't need a distraction like that right now. The group separated after a while, with Zorian leaving to find Kiriel. There was one last thing he wanted to do before the end. Kiri, do you think you could show me your drawings? He asked. She didn't need much convincing. She ran out of the room and soon returned with a thick stack of papers that represented her artistic endeavor over the course of the past month. She drew anything that caught her fancy. It seemed the sparrows that liked to gather on the street in front of Amaya's house, the house they lived in and its inhabitants, the trees in the nearby park where she played with Nachka, and so on. He was especially impressed with the handful of images that depicted Scioria's main train station. Not only did she remember what all the various storefronts they'd visited looked like, she even memorized many of the individual items that had been on sale. Zorian had forgotten most of that stuff roughly 5 minutes after they had left the train station, but Kiriel had remembered it well enough to draw a realistic picture of it an entire day afterwards. If he ever found some time to kill, he should ask Kiriel to teach him how to draw. He doubted he would be any good at it, but the mental image of his little sister trying to teach him something was amusing. "And this one is Nachka's kitty lair," Kiriel fumbled, barely catching herself in time. She threw him a panicked look and then tried to shove the drawing of the young black cat beneath some of the already inspected drawings. Heh. Her kitty form, perhaps? Zorian asked innocently. "You knew?" Kiriel gasped. "I knew," he confirmed. "So could you tell she's a shifter on your own, or is she simply as bad at keeping secrets as you are?" "I'm not bad at keeping secrets," she protested. "And, she kind of slipped that she can do magic and I bugged her until she showed me what she can do." "Ah yes, the eternal tendency of people to brag about their skills." Well, that and Kiriel's incredible ability to keep bringing the subject up until the victim decides it's easier to just give in and humor her. He didn't blame Nachka for giving in, considering how often he ended up doing the same. Nachka's indiscretion aside, there were no further surprises waiting for him among Kiriel's drawings. He then tried to cast the memorization spell to commit the entire stack to his memory, but found that Kiriel was intensely protective of her work and strangely suspicious of his actions. It took a while for Zorian to convince Kiriel that the spell he wanted to cast was totally non-destructive and that he wouldn't even dream of burning her artwork or anything similar. Really, where did she even get the idea? "Fortov once burned a bunch of my drawings when I asked him to show me some magic," she admitted. "Said it was a joke." Zorian rolled his eyes. Yes, that sounded about right for Fortov. Knowing Kiriel, she was probably being extremely annoying and disruptive, but that was still a very shitty thing to do. "I'm kind of insulted you'd compare me to Fortov, but whatever," Zorian said. He quickly memorized the stack and handed it back to her. "There. All done." Kiriel quickly leafed through the papers to make sure he really hadn't done any damage and then left to put the drawings back to her room. She was back soon enough, though, looking worried. "Zorian, why did you want to memorize my drawings?" she asked. "You could just ask me to show them to you whenever you wanted to take a look. Are you going somewhere?" Zorian gave her a sideways glance, wondering what to tell her. He would be leaving her behind during the next few restarts, and he kind of felt guilty about it, but there was no helping it. It was why he was wasting some of his mental space on her drawings instead of filling it out with something more practical. She was pretty observant to have come to that conclusion, though. She probably noticed some of his other preparations. "Yes," he admitted. "I am. After the summer festival." "Oh," she said. "But don't you have to attend classes?" "Well, yes. But this is more important," he said. "Don't worry, I won't be gone long. You won't even notice I'm gone." Surprisingly, she accepted this explanation without complaints. Good. The last thing he needed was for her to freak out this close to the end. "But," she decided, "you have to bring me a gift when you come back. Or I'm telling Mom you left me alone with a bunch of strangers." "Sure," said Zorian, rolling his eyes. He wondered if gifting her with the drawings she'd drawn herself in previous restarts counted as cheating. Probably. But he was going to do it anyway, just to see how she reacted. The dimensional gate beneath Scioria was a difficult target to approach. One had to avoid numerous Abasan patrol groups to even get near it, and then the prospective attacker had to deal with an entire defensive base built around the gate if they wanted to actually pass through. Storming such a place was a task for a battle group, not a single mage, and would give the defenders plenty of time to shut down the gate if they felt the base was about to fall. Not to mention that Quadikikl could and probably would come to their aid if such a major assault was launched on the place. No, the only viable way of accessing the gate was to sneak in somehow. A rather unlikely endeavor, considering the place was teeming with mages and war trolls, and likely had plenty of detection wards layered on top of it too. But Zorian had a plan. A rather reckless plan that he'd never even think about trying outside of the time loop, but it was a plan regardless. At its core, it rested on the assumption that the Abasins would send almost everyone they had to participate in the invasion proper, leaving only a handful of defenders to guard the gate. Thus, the best time to make the attempt was when the invasion had already begun. If the Abasins were smart and cautious, that wouldn't be true and his plan would be over before it even began. If they were really smart and cautious, the gate would be shut down the moment the invasion began and all of his plotting would have been for nothing. But Zorian was willing to bet that the Abasins needed all the manpower they could get for the fighting on the surface, and that the leadership needed the gate functioning so they could retreat safely to their island. There was a lot of sea between Eldamar and Oquin Abasa. He was hoping they would just leave behind a skeleton crew at the base, with orders to summon Quatakikl if they get into more trouble than they can handle. Thus, when the day of the invasion had finally come, Zorian immediately descended deep into the tunnel system beneath Cyoria and started looking for some nasty critters to dominate. Something strong enough to cause a distraction, but weak enough that the defenders wouldn't panic when it started throwing itself on the base defenses. Just a random monster attack that would distract everyone and give Zorian a chance to slip inside unnoticed. It took him some time, but he eventually found a pack of hooked goblins, small, flightless, bat-like humanoids whose front limbs sported huge, hook-like claws. Highly dangerous up close but easily killable. A threat but not that much of a threat. Perfect. Then he waited. As time went by, his prediction of Abasins withdrawing virtually everyone to participate in the invasion gradually came to pass. The Abasins were indeed withdrawing nearly all patrol groups around their base, allowing Zorian to finally approach the place and lay his eyes on the center of Abasin invasion. Well, he already knew its basic layout from the memories extracted from the captured Abasins, but that wasn't the same as seeing it firsthand. The base was situated in a massive cavern, and was quite large. It was practically a small town, which was not very surprising considering the amount of forces the Abasins normally kept here. In the center of the settlement stood a handful of stone buildings that were probably raised from the cavern floor via alteration. The gate was in the middle of this section, serving as the heart of the settlement. Surrounding the fancy stone buildings was a ramshackle collection of tents and pens where the peons and war trolls lived. There were no walls around the settlement, but each of the tunnels connecting to the cavern had a checkpoint that served as a first line of defense. Zorian waited for a while for the numbers to thin out further, and when they remained static for a while, mentally pushed the hook goblins to attack one of the checkpoints, doing his best to boost their bloodthirstiness and suppress their fear. He didn't have to do much. Honestly, hook goblins seemed to be almost perpetually angry creatures, going utterly berserk at even the slightest provocation. They fell upon the checkpoint, screeching and clawing, and the base immediately went into an uproar. Zorian's original idea was to use the distraction to attack one of the other checkpoints while everyone else was distracted, but that turned out to be unnecessary. When he reached his chosen target, he found out that its guards were unprofessional enough to leave their posts to help out their buddies against the hook goblins. Or maybe the base was even more short on manpower than he originally suspected. No matter, he decided to simply take advantage of the situation and waltzed in. He made it all the way to the gate without being stopped, or even confronted by anyone. At one point he crossed paths with a mage running towards the battle site, but it only took a weak suggestion from Zorian that he was completely normal, nothing to see here, and the man promptly put him out of his mind and kept running. He honestly didn't expect it to be that easy. Unfortunately, when he reached the dimensional gate itself, he found that it had its own guards and that they refused to leave their posts, despite the commotion. 4 mages and 2 trolls. He could deal with them perhaps, but he didn't think he could do it without raising a ruckus. Shame. He was just about to throw caution to the wind and start chucking around fireballs and explosive cubes everywhere, when one of the other defenders came running and started shouting at the mages around the gate. The hook goblins had broken through the checkpoint and the newcomer wanted them to signal Quatakikl to come and save them. Oops. He honestly didn't think his little minions would end up winning. It seemed that not only did the Abasins leave a skeleton crew to hold the base, said skeleton crew was composed out of the dregs of their force. No wonder this infiltration was so easy. Fortunately for Zorian, no summoning of Quata-Kickle would take place. The mages guarding seemed horrified at the very idea. Their leader ranted for an entire minute about how the ancient lich would have them all flayed alive if they summoned him to deal with a bunch of stinking hook goblins, and eventually sent 2 of his fellow guards and both of the war trolls to contain the incursion. Zorian could only watch incredulously as the gate was suddenly left with only 2 mages to guard it. Well, that certainly made things easier. He waited for a while for the other Abasins to get some distance away from the gate and then chucked a vial of sleeping gas at the 2 remaining guards from his hiding place. One of them, the one that spoke to the panicked defender and seemed to be their leader, managed to stumble out of the cloud in a semi-lucid state and promptly received a piercer in the head for his troubles. The other collapsed into sleep, as intended, and Zorian blew the cloud away with a gust of wind before hurriedly approaching the dimensional gate they were guarding. Zorian itched to examine the thing in greater detail, but no, this wasn't the time for that. The current priority was to find out what was on the other side. Looking through the opening itself, he could see that the gate led to an empty, spacious room devoid of further guards. Which was rather weird, were the Abasins really leaving one end of the gate undefended? He tried extending his mind sense through the dimensional opening and was pleased to note that the gate was no barrier to his mind sense. And even gladder that he could detect no hidden enemies. Suspicious, but mindful of the limited amount of time he had, he took a deep breath and stepped through the gate. He felt a tendril of magic brush against his soul protections the moment his foot touched the floor of the destination room, trying to identify him. It recoiled from his spiritual defense, and Zorian immediately felt the atmosphere in the room change, becoming heavier and more foreboding. He had been detected by the wards and labeled as an intruder. Behind him, the edges of the dimensional opening started crackling with lightning. The gate then began rapidly shrinking and soon winked out of existence entirely in a soft flash of light. Though the closing of the portal had taken him off guard, Zorian was ultimately unconcerned about its disappearance. He was already through, after all, and at least this way the Abasin forces on the other end of the gate wouldn't be able to pursue him. He quickly looked around and confirmed that the room was indeed empty, aside from the now inactive stone icosahedron erected in the center of it. There was only one door in sight, and Zorian immediately blasted it to splinters rather than open it normally. No need to risk getting hit with some hostile ward effect because he was dumb enough to grasp the handle. Quickly leaving the gate room, he started exploring the place, trying to find out as much as he could before the Abasin forces on this side of the gate, alerted by the wards, came running to deal with him. Then the defenders of the place finally tracked him down, and he understood where he was. The undead boar that just tried to bite his leg off was exactly like the ones that assaulted Lukav every restart. He was in the Sorokian Highlands. Specifically, he was in Ayaska Mansion. And the place was apparently teeming with undead. He frantically dodged a knife thrust by his assailant, a silent, knife-wielding man wrapped in concealing black clothes. Zorian had shot him through his head with a piercer earlier, but that didn't seem to bother him too much. Another black-clad, knife-wielding corpse advanced at him from the left, and the blasted boar looked like it was readying for another charge. Zorian threw a glowing cylinder on the ground in front of him, causing a disruptive, dispelling pulse to wash over everything around him. The 3 corpses attacking him collapsed lifelessly to the ground, the pulse having destroyed the magic that kept their animating souls bound to their bodies. Zorian sighed. That was the 3rd dispeller grenade he had been forced to use since coming to this place. He'd only ever had 5 of them to start with, not having expected to fight hordes of undead today. Most of his other single-use items were gone as well. He knew this mission was likely to result in his violent death, but this was still kind of annoying. And also more than a little dangerous. The presence of so much undead meant there were necromancers inside. It might actually be dangerous to die here. He was just about to go back to the gate room and barricade himself there when a living person entered his mind sense, heading straight for him. Well, crap. That was the necromancer, wasn't it? Of course it was. That must be why the undead backed off after that last attack. He quickly scattered his remaining explosive cubes on the floor in front of him and retreated deeper into the corridor. Then the door on the other end of the corridor opened and a tall, muscular man with a huge mustache stepped into the corridor. He took one look at Zorian and smiled jovially, like seeing an old friend who he hadn't heard from in years. "Welcome," he said. "I am Sudamir Kandrii, the owner of this humble abode. May I ask why you have invaded my home?" "I don't know what you're talking about," said Zorian, taking a step back. "Step deeper into the corridor, step deeper into the corridor." The door was quite open, all I had to do was step through the gate. "If you didn't want anyone coming through, surely you wouldn't have left that thing so unprotected. Why, I bet a whole army could just waltz through this place if you weren't careful." Zorian took another step back. Sudamir followed him, taking a step deeper into the corridor. "Now." Zorian sent a pulse of mana to the explosive cubes, triggering them and sending the entire corridor into a. No, actually nothing happened at all. What the hell? Wards. Wonderful things, aren't they? Sudamir smiled. "I can't have things exploding in my own home, you see. And besides, even if you did catch me in that trap, that wouldn't have killed me. I assure you I am quite hard to kill." "Lovely." Zorian stared at the man in front of him for a second and then concentrated on his marker for a second. "What are you doing?" Sudamir asked harshly. He could probably see that he was doing something with his soul. Damn necromancers and their cheating soul sight. Zorian ignored him and ordered one of the slots of the marker, the one that actually gave him an impression of what it was supposed to do, to activate. His vision immediately turned dark and then he woke up back in Siren, Kiriel wishing him a good morning. He sighed in relief, confusing Kiriel. Thank the gods that worked. Sitting alone in the train's compartment, Zorian stared through the window at the passing landscape, lost in thought and not really paying attention to what he was looking at. He was supposed to have disembarked already, but the events that had happened at the end of the previous restart were still at the forefront of his mind and he figured it was best to delay his plans for a few hours until he was less distracted. It wasn't like he had some tight schedule to follow this early into the restart. Closing his eyes for a second, he searched his soul for the marker switch he'd used to escape Sudamir and immersed himself in the impressions it gave him whenever he connected to it. The switch in question did not announce its purpose in words, but it made itself understood anyway. It was the abrupt end of everything, followed by a return to the beginning. Revert to starting point. That was what the switch claimed its function was, and, as far as Zorian could tell, that is exactly what it had done when he'd used it at the end of the previous restart. He had a way to end the current restart at whim. He could start over at any time without leaving behind a soul that could be interrogated and messed with. Hell, he wouldn't be leaving behind anything. The world would end on his command. All it took was pressing a switch. That changed everything. Necromancy, in many ways his worst enemy, was suddenly a lot less dangerous and frightening. The risk of having his suicide rings taken away or negated by fancy wards also became a lot less worrisome. The marker was virtually impossible to detect or take away from him. Many ideas he had previously dismissed on the grounds that they were too dangerous to attempt, such as exploring Ayaska Mansion or pissing off Quatakikl by aggressively going after Abasin forces, were suddenly back on the table. Getting killed or knocked out before he could react was still a danger, though, as was the possibility of being drugged into submission. He wondered if he could set up some sort of contingency to trigger the revert switch automatically upon his death. It would require delving deeper into soul magic, but that may be a smart thing to do anyway, and eliminating one of his major remaining weaknesses was no small feat. A possible issue was that the revert switch might affect Zack and Red Robe as well, not just him. Was their restart cut short as a consequence of his action in the previous restart? Probably. It must have been, if the switch worked like he thought it did. There was a chance they'd failed to note the abrupt end, since he'd activated the revert switch very close to the time it usually ended at anyway, but since he intended to keep using the revert switch, that wasn't going to last very long. It didn't really matter, though, even if they had noticed. Both Zack and Red Robe had already known there were at least 2 other time travelers in the time loop, so this told them nothing particularly important. Well, it might come as a bit of a shock to Zack, since he'd never had his restart cut short like that, but whatever. He could now experience what it was like for Zorian when the other boy went around fighting dragons and whatnot. Opening his eyes, Zorian withdrew from the marker and refocused his attention on the passing landscape for a bit. It did not hold his attention for long before his mind drifted back to the events of the previous restart. Truthfully, he hadn't expected his gate exploration initiative to be as successful as it ended up being. He had expected to face better and more numerous defenses on the Sciorian side of the gate, and once he managed to step through it, he expected to emerge into another heavily guarded Abasin base. He hadn't expected to live long once on the other side. In fact, it honestly would not have surprised him if he had died before ever reaching the gate itself, never mind actually accomplishing much on the other side. The first try had been primarily about testing the Abasin defenses to see what he was dealing with. Well, apparently he had been far too modest in his ambitions. He got everything he had been hoping for, and more. Now that he knew just how undermanned and unprofessional the defense of the gate was, and that there were no Abasin reinforcements on the other side to come to their aid, he could afford to be a lot more direct in future attempts. Bringing a small army of golems and wiping out every defender so he could study the gate at his leisure actually seemed like a viable option. Granted, he would have to do it without giving the defenders a chance to summon Quetzalcoatl, but it seemed doable. As a bonus, said golems would be heaven-sent against the hordes of undead infesting Ayaska Mansion. They were just as tireless as the living dead, and had no souls for the necromancer to mess with. Of course, it was impossible to think about Ayaska Mansion without automatically considering that final confrontation he'd had with Sudamir Kandrii at the end, and that soured Zorian's feeling of success somewhat. He got out of the situation unscathed in the end, but the fact was, he got thoroughly outplayed and backed into a corner by a dangerous necromancer and had to rely on an untested ability to escape from his clutches. That wasn't the way Zorian wanted his conflicts to go. To be fair, though, the situation might not have been as bad as it looked. The restart was nearing its end by that point, so perhaps he could have stalled the man long enough to avoid any serious consequences. Failing that, he could have thrown a maximized fireball at his feet and hoped that reducing his body to fine ash interfered with Sudamir's ability to snare his soul. It was hard to know how dangerous the situation truly had been without knowing more about Sudamir's personality, or the limits of his necromancy skills. Well, he was going to find out more about the man very soon. For one thing, Sudamir was the mayor of Nyazov Dveri, and therefore a public figure. There should be lots of information available about him, in both official and unofficial sources. For another, Zorian intended to keep attacking the gate beneath Scioria and exploring Ayaska Mansion at the end of every future restart. There was no reason to pass up on that. Really, the defenses of the gate were sufficiently flimsy that it wouldn't eat much into his schedule to organize an assault at the end of the month, and the Revert switch made the idea of exploring a necromancer's lair a lot less crazy than it was up until recently. He definitely had to do something about the wards on the place, though. Sudamir seemed to have placed some very sophisticated stuff on Ayaska Mansion, and Zorian didn't feel comfortable just ignoring them. Who knows what kind of exotic, forbidden stuff a necromancer like Sudamir wove into his warding scheme. Maybe he could avoid triggering the wards at all. If he could find some way to pass the initial authorization test upon stepping through the gate, the wards should stay dormant. There had to be a keystone or some such that let people pass through unmolested. There was no way Sudamir keyed in every individual Abasin into the damn ward scheme. After some thought, he decided that such a bypass would be useful, but would likely just delay the problem. If it was Zorian in Sudamir's place, he would have definitely placed further tripwires around the mansion to foil such abuse. Considering how much Sudamir relied on his wards to deal with intruders, he was bound to have thought of that and more. He was wrenched out of his musings by the voice of the station announcer, who informed him that the train was soon going to arrive to its next destination. Deciding he had delayed things a bit too much as it was, Zorian grabbed his luggage and went off in search of an exit. It was time to visit the Iranian colonies again. The last time Zorian had tried to get instructions from the luminous advocates, the result was a frustrating negotiation process that had lasted for nearly 3 weeks and had consumed the entirety of his funds in exchange for useful, but decidedly non-critical knowledge. The one thing he had needed back then, they had been unwilling to teach him. Consequently, he had stopped bothering with them. Especially since he had since found other, much more reasonable webs to trade with. The situation had changed, however. He was a lot better at mind magic now, so they should hopefully look down on him a lot less. He was also in a much better position to satisfy their assorted demands, thanks to the discovery of the Iranian treasury back in Syoria and the ability to steal money and resources from the cult of the World Dragon by raiding their caches. Finally, after getting taught about Iranian culture and customs from Voice of Peace, he had come to a conclusion that he had likely bungled his previous interaction with luminous advocate somewhat. He had come off as impatient and disrespectful, which probably had a lot to do with them dragging the negotiations out for several weeks. It was both the means of pressuring him into giving them greater concessions and a way of getting back at him for a perceived slight. That was why, when Zorian went off to meet with the luminous advocates on the first day of the restart, he didn't offer a trade proposal. Instead, he simply introduced himself and asked for a meeting sometime in the future. He was told to come back in 2 days. He did just that, at which point he presented the luminous advocates with a gift and spent several hours pretending he'd just dropped by to have a friendly chat with them instead of anything serious. Only then did he present his offer, starting with a very ambitious plan where he offered a lot and demanded just as much. They refused, of course, making a counteroffer that was ridiculously more in their favor, and so the negotiations began. It took them an entire week and a half to agree on a deal in the end, which was slow and annoying, but still a lot better than before. The agreement, much like the one he'd had with the filigree sages in the previous restart, went beyond his primary goal of learning how to repair memory packets and also encompassed refinement of his basic telepathy skills, practice of mental combat techniques and further development of his ability to tap into and interpret Iranian senses. The last one was not something the luminous advocates had any real experience with, by their own admission, but they were willing to lend him their considerable expertise on the topic. In fact, that was the part of the deal they seemed most excited about. Of course, Zorian didn't spend said week and a half idling around while the luminous advocates dragged their feet. He spent most of that time scouting out other Iranian webs to see what they were able and willing to offer him. He visited the talisman bearers, ghost serpent acolytes and silent doorway adepts, the 3 shady webs that the illustrious gem collectors had informed him about back when he'd first sought other Iranian webs to learn from. Back then he didn't feel safe dealing with them, but his skills at shielding his mind had grown considerably since then. He also toured the 7 webs in the vicinity of Syoria that he'd found out about from the filigree sages: the burning apex, red brand bearers, deep blue, crystal torches, indestructible silver order, stone revelation chanters and riddles of opening. All of them were interesting in their own way, but none of them could really help him with his memory packet repairing problem better than the luminous advocates could. The talisman bearers were a magic-focused web, the most heavily magic-focused one that Zorian had ever encountered, and were thus a bad choice to go to when dealing with a relatively exotic mind magic issue like his. Still, visiting them had not been a waste of time in the slightest. Out of curiosity, he had bought several of the metal discs they used for their spellcasting to see how they worked. The spell formula designs etched into the discs blew him away, subjected to size and scarcity restrictions largely foreign to human spellcasting communities. The talisman bearers focused on squeezing in as many spells as they possibly could onto their primary spellcasting tool. The design was complex and incredibly dense, but it worked smoothly and efficiently, without the destructive resonances and disruptions that usually plagued such highly compressed spell formula constructs. The discs were useless to Zorian in their natural state. He wasn't an Irania, and these tools were very much intended for Iranian use. Still, they were sufficiently similar to human spell formula that he could learn a lot from studying them. Considering how much he relied on items, any advantage in that area was noteworthy. The ghost serpent acolytes refused to see him. Apparently their god/guardian spirit told them he was bad news and that they should tell him to get lost. He had no idea what that was about, but it automatically made the web a lot more interesting than he expected. What did the spirit know about Zorian that pissed it off so much? He left the ghost serpent acolytes alone for now, but he made a mental note to visit the web again in the next restart, before doing anything else, to see if they reacted the same way. The silent doorway adepts were another surprise, because the doorway in their name came from the Bakura gate around which they built their settlement. That was very, very interesting. They got really uncomfortable when he started asking questions about it, too, blatantly trying to change the subject. They claimed the gate mystified them as much as it mystified humans, but Zorian wasn't sure he believed that. There was definitely a story there, and their web was famous for having some kind of secret magic that allowed them to get into places. Still, it was obvious he wouldn't be getting anything out of them on the topic, so he politely backed off and moved on to other topics. Sadly, they had no interest in teaching him things. They pointed him back towards some of the webs he'd already known about, such as the luminous advocates, and that was that. That was not to say they were not interested in trade, though they very much were. They showed passing interest in most of the stuff he offered, but what really caught their attention was crystallized mana. They really wanted crystallized mana. For some reason they were willing to take all of it off his hands, if he was willing, or as much as he could spare otherwise. In exchange, they offered a wide variety of magical items and tomes, all clearly of human origin and many of them very much illegal. They also offered to put him in contact with some of their human trade partners, in case he wanted something they currently lacked. They also admitted, after some prodding, that they could provide him with information about other Iranian webs where they could be found, what they were famous for, and what their weaknesses were. They warned him, however, that they would cut all ties with him if he misused such information. After some thought, Zorian asked them about alternatives to the luminous advocates when it came to mind magic specialists, agreeing to their price for such information. After a few hours, their representative returned with the information in question, giving him the names and locations for about 8 more webs that were notable for their mind magic mastery. He thanked them for the information and left. The 7 webs around Scioria all had some things in common. For one, they were all very friendly to humans and a lot easier to talk to than any of the other webs he had been interacting with recently. For another, they were all magic-focused webs. Scioria was the epicenter of the Iranian magical revolution, and all nearby webs had adapted to take advantage of that in some fashion. Finally, they were a lot more hostile to their neighbors than the other webs he had spoken with. The Burning Apex, Red Brand Bearers, Crystal Torches and Indestructible Silver Order all tried to hire him to attack their neighbors, and the Burning Apex outright stated that they intended to massacre the entire riddles of opening web whenever they got the chance, down to the last male and child. Oh, and all of them were very interested in any information about the Sciorian webs and any possible weaknesses they might have. Zorian suddenly understood why Spear of Resolve had been so worried about her neighbors and wanted to get humans on her side. Thankfully, none of the webs actually insisted that he had to help fight their battles, and were happy enough to engage in more peaceful forms of trade. Naturally, Zorian was primarily interested in mind magic instruction. The local groups, although primarily magic-focused, did have decent grasp of their innate mind magic, especially when it came to telepathic combat. Most of them were fine in tutoring him in their abilities, although the Stone Revelation Chanters and Indestructible Silver Order required a higher level of commitment than he was able to spare in this particular restart. In addition, most of them also traded in exotic alchemical ingredients gathered in the deep dungeon, some of which were impossible to acquire on the open market. Unfortunately, it was impossible to hide from a bunch of natural mind readers that he had contacted other Arania groups in the area while receiving tutoring in mind magic from them, so he could only get instruction from one of the local webs. Most of them didn't care if he was also receiving instruction from the luminous advocates, though, except for the Crystal Torches, who refused to teach him anything if they weren't the only ones teaching him. He chose Deep Blue in the end, because they were one of the 3 major webs in the area and struck him as the most peaceful of the lot. Also, Deep Blue Mind Magic specialized in dominating and manipulating the various monstrous denizens of the dungeon. Zorian figured their methods of dealing with creatures very different from themselves might also be useful in his quest to understand the Iranian mind. And if not, well, being more effective at hurting and neutralizing magical creatures was still a pretty useful skill to have. Thus, he'd secured himself 2 tutorships from 2 different Irania groups for the restart. The luminous advocates complained, questioning the usefulness of a web like Deep Blue when he'd already secured the services of the best, but Zorian couldn't help but notice that they got rather more motivated in their teaching ever since he'd done that. Trying to arrange for a 3rd group of Iranian teachers would definitely be a mistake, though. Best not be too greedy. Not much happened until the very end of the restart. He dutifully kept learning mind magic from the luminous advocates and Deep Blue, and when he wasn't doing that, he was advancing his studies in other magical disciplines and preparing things for the upcoming gate assault at the end of the restart. He was rapidly going through magical books he'd recovered from the Iranian treasury in Scioria, writing down any interesting spell he could find and outright memorizing ones that looked particularly useful. Ward analysis, divinations, new combat spells, mind magic of the more structured kind. He'd learned so many new spells he had trouble remembering them all. He was also steadily trying out new shaping exercises, writing down which ones were easiest to work with, which ones had a trick to doing them right, and which ones became much easier if he did some other exercises before them. He was surprised how lacking the various exercise manuals were in regards to crucial information like that. By the time the restart was nearing its end, Zorian was ready for another attempt at the gate. He had adjusted his arsenal in light of what he had discovered about his opponents and thus had made 6 golems to bring along with him as support. He'd also captured several Abasins during his trips to Scioria, trying to discover a method of passing through the gate without triggering the wards on Ayaska Mansion. Sadly, none of them knew the answer to that particular mystery. He could only hope that the actual gate guards were better informed. Finally, he had tried to find out as much as he could about Sudamir Kandriai without attracting too much attention. Since the secret master of Ayaska Mansion was also the mayor of Nyazov Dveri, he did that by teleporting to the town in question and started asking people questions and reading their minds while they talked. He found out that Sudamir had an excellent reputation among the people he governed. He was a capable administrator under whom the city grew a lot more rich and influential than it had previously been. He took full advantage of Eldamar's northern colonization drive to catapult the city to prominence, and then generously spread the wealth gained from that among the locals. He was known to be a rather secretive and private person, but very friendly and talkative when actually interacting with others. He was a powerful and talented mage, with a specialty in wards. His wife had died during the weeping, and he was hurt deeply by it, never bothering to remarry. Interestingly, Ayaska Mansion wasn't as big of a secret as Zorian first imagined it to be. Quite a few people knew that Sudamir had some kind of secret hideout in the wilderness to the north, and that shady stuff happened there. However, most people thought that Sudamir's brand of shoddiness involved smuggling of restricted merchandise and organizing drug-fueled orgies and whatnot. Basically, they thought he was connected to organized crime groups, not that he was animating corpses and betraying the country. On the day of the summer festival, Zorian went to Scioria and descended into the dungeon below the city to wait for the invasion to start. He couldn't find the group of hook goblins he'd used previously. Him not being in Scioria and killing monsters with Taven had completely altered the distribution of monsters in the dungeon compared to the previous restart, so in the end he settled for a female tentacle-tailed scorpion. Mostly because she had hundreds of young, and they followed her lead in everything. If he ordered her to attack the Abasin base, they would do the same, with no need for specific directions coming from him. Zorian slipped into the base while she and her brood distracted the defenders, much like he had last time. The golems, being much slower than him and very unstealthy, were ordered to stay behind while he went off to subdue the more disciplined mages and war trolls stationed around the gate itself. The war trolls were annoying. He needed the mages alive so he could interrogate them about the gate protections and the methods they used to summon Quadakikl, but anything that would disable them would also fail to work against the war trolls. After some thought, he simply set up incineration traps a fair distance away from the gate and then started using a combination of guidance spells and gas bombs to bombard the area around the gate from a fair distance away. He turned the entire area into a thick cloud of sleeping gas, probably wasting more than half of the bombs needlessly, but whatever. The important thing was that the mages all ended up incapacitated and the war trolls came running after him, screaming their heads off. They ran straight into the incineration traps, but rather than dying a horrible, fiery death, they survived the experience just fine. It took only a second for Zorian to realize what was happening. They weren't regular war trolls, no, these were the same sort of hyper-resilient ones that he and Taven had encountered in one of the previous restarts. The ones that shrugged off fire. He teleported away in time to avoid being crushed to a pulp by the huge iron maces the two trolls wielded, but it was a short-distance teleport and they were upon him again in a heartbeat. The resulting battle, which consisted mostly of Zorian teleporting around and throwing things at increasingly angry and injured war trolls, resulted in expenditure of nearly all of his prepared explosives and the destruction of 4 of his golems when he was forced to summon them as distractions halfway throughout the battle. Damn it! But at least he was alive and well, and the same could not be said of his opponents. The war trolls were eventually frozen solid by freezing rays, after which he shattered them into pieces just to be sure. Live and learn next time he was using frost traps instead. Checking up on the rest of the Abasins, he found them losing against the tentacle-tailed scorpions. They managed to wound the mother, but that only made her spawn go berserk with rage and they surged forth with suicidal fury. The Abasins scattered in front of them, and Zorian made sure to pick off anyone that looked like they were actually making a dent in the horde or trying to organize the defenders. With most of the threats neutralized, he went back to the gate and banished the cloud of sleeping gas that clung to the place so he could reach the mages he'd incapacitated. What he found from their minds was encouraging. First of all, the 4 he'd incapacitated were the only ones that knew how to contact Quatakikl. That was why the other defenders came to beg them for help in the previous restart. They weren't asking for permission to summon Quatakikl, they literally didn't know how to do it themselves. The method itself consisted of a simple sending spell, though one that required a particular keystone to actually reach the ancient lich. He had seen the keystone in question before, he realized. It was the teardrop-shaped amulet of polished black stone that high-ranking Abasins always wore. He thought it was a purely ornamental thing to mark their station to other Abasins, since it gave off no magic and had nothing whatsoever etched into its surface, but apparently he was wrong. Even now he could not figure out how it was supposed to work as a keystone, and he didn't dare analyze it too deeply, lest he trip some invisible tripwire and summon Quatakikl to his location. He didn't feel like receiving a disintegration beam to the face at the moment. Also, the way to enter the gate properly consisted of letting a high-ranking Abasin step through the gate first. This signaled to the wards in Ayaska Mansion that everything was fine and everyone who entered after them is with them and thus also okay by association. Zorian did not know whether these specific Abasins were keyed into the wards themselves or if the wards were detecting the presence of the keystone they all had on their person, and he didn't care. He simply pushed one of the unconscious Abasins through the gate, amulet included, and stepped through afterwards. Just to be safe, he instructed his 2 surviving golems to immediately follow after him. He breathed a sigh of relief when the wards failed to react to his presence and the gate didn't close. Success. Let's see what I can find before Sudamir realizes he has an intruder in his home, Zorian mumbled to himself, stepping over the unconscious body of the Abasin he pushed through the gate. He motioned his 2 golem bodyguards to follow after him and then moved deeper into Ayaska Mansion. Considering it was one of the invasion points used to attack Scioria, Ayaska Mansion was surprisingly empty. Now that he didn't have to dodge undead attackers all the time, Zorian had time to explore the interior and was baffled by how seemingly ordinary it was. It was an empty, but otherwise unexceptional mansion. He encountered neither traps nor undead until he tried to move towards the very center of the mansion, where he suspected Sudamir was located. At that point he crossed some invisible threshold and he felt the wards try to probe his soul and fail. A heavy feeling promptly settled down around him as the wards concentrated their energies around him. Knowing that the hordes of undead inside the place were making their way towards him and no longer caring about stealth, Zorian started testing the wards to see what exactly they did. He began by throwing one of his last remaining explosives in front of him and activating it to see if it would work. It did, but that didn't necessarily mean the adjustments he'd made since last time were actually working. In the previous restart, his explosives had worked just fine at first, only to suddenly fail when he faced off against Sudamir. In all likelihood, the warding scheme only turned on its heaviest defenses when Sudamir commanded it to do so, and left them dormant otherwise to conserve mana. Trying to scry on the dimensional gate to see if it had closed when the wards turned on him failed. Nothing inside the house could be targeted by any of the divination spells he was aware of. Teleporting out didn't work, and connecting a recall tether to a stone cylinder and launching it through the window as far as it could go didn't allow him to recall himself out of the place either. The wards were also filling the entire mansion with a low-powered shaping disruption field, not enough to stop him from casting things, but definitely making his spellcasting take longer and require more concentration. He considered simply escaping. Outside through the windows, a surprisingly viable option, since they were very large and could be opened easily from the inside, but decided not to. Sudamir seemed pretty talkative in the previous restart, and now that Zorian knew he had a guaranteed way out, he wanted to see what would happen if he talked to the man. Maybe Sudamir was the sort of person who liked to gloat. It was stupid, but there were people like that. Over the next half an hour, Zorian fought against an endless stream of undead. Unlike last time, he was able to conserve his dispeller grenades and other items by relying on his golems to keep some of the animated corpses busy while he tackled the rest. He was sufficiently effective at whittling down the army of undead, in fact, that Sudamir eventually decided to withdraw his remaining forces rather than see them all destroyed. Or at least that's what Zorian assumed, since all of the undead boars and black-clad corpses turned and fled at some point. He did not expect that. He wondered whether Sudamir would even show up without Zorian being completely exhausted by his minions. Sudamir was clearly watching him, either through divinations or via some spying function embedded into the wards, so he surely knew Zorian was still dangerous to approach. Shrugging, Zorian started analyzing the wards with the help of the ward analysis device he took from the Iranian treasury. If Sudamir decided to stay away, that just meant he could deconstruct his warding scheme at his leisure, and that was still a win in his book. Like he suspected, the wards did not like him trying to figure them out. If he hadn't already outed himself as an intruder, he was certain that his current attempt at analysis would have branded him as such immediately. Zorian expected as much. That was why he hadn't tried that the moment he stepped through the dimensional gate. What he didn't expect was for the wards to actively fight back against his analysis. The shifting of the local ward fields around him and the repeated disrupting pulses directed his way were disturbingly adaptive, too intelligently used to come from a mindless spell construct. Was Sudamir somehow adjusting the warding scheme on the fly, or were the wards themselves somehow intelligent? The air in front of him shimmered in a vaguely humanoid shape, and Zorian immediately fired a force lance at the spot. The shimmer was unaffected, though, and soon solidified into a ghostly image of a familiar man. A tall, older, muscular man, dressed in an expensive brown suit. He had a huge mustache and a smiling, sunny expression on his face. Zorian wasn't fooled, though. While Sudamir's illusionary projection tried to give off an air of happy indifference, his smile was noticeably more strained compared to how it was the last time he had seen him. "Hi there." Sudamir greeted him through his projection. "I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this is a private residence. You can't just come in here and start tearing the place apart. What did I ever do to you, anyway? I'm surprised you're willing to show your face so openly, Sudamir Kandrii," Zorian stated, scanning his surroundings to make sure Sudamir was not trying to distract him with his projection while setting up a surprise attack. "Ha! A mage of your caliber doesn't stumble into a place like this accidentally," Sudamir scoffed. "Your skills, your equipment, you already knew who and what was here, I'm sure. The interesting question is, who are you? It's only polite to introduce yourself to people, don't you know? Why did you help the Abasins organize their attack on Scioria? Zorian asked, not interested in giving any personal information to Sudamir and not really finding the man's antics amusing. The death toll is in the thousands, and will only grow larger by the end. What did those people ever do to you, Sudamir? Ah. It's nothing personal, really, Sudamir shrugged, his smile dimming somewhat. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Politics can be brutal like that. Politics? Asked Zorian incredulously. They're trying to release a primordial to rampage around the continent and you think that's somehow in your political interest. I can understand how the Abasins think this is a good thing for them, but what about you? Why would you want that to happen? Sudamir stared at him for a second with a judging look on his face. So you know about that too, huh? He said, clacking his tongue in distaste. Well, I don't think I feel comfortable discussing my goals with you, my dear home invader. However, just between you and me, I'd wager the Abasins are too optimistic about this primordial's supposed danger level. It's going to do a lot of damage, I'm sure, but to imagine it running around the continent, destroying things at whim? Not a chance. I give it at best a week before Eldamar gathers enough troops to kill it. And that's assuming it's not just a dumb animal that will wander into the first trap they set for it. That's a very reckless attitude to have about the scenario, Zorian frowned. What if you're wrong? Nothing in life comes without risk, Sudamir said in a lecturing voice. Ugh. He was going nowhere with this conversation, and the man was blatantly stalling for time. He dispelled the projection with a wave of his hand and started walking towards the center of the mansion again, his two golem bodyguards walking in front of him. There was no point in trying to analyze the wards again, since he couldn't get through the weirdly intelligent safeguards Sudamir had put in place to prevent such things. Another ghostly projection shimmered into existence in front of him, but he dispelled it before it had a chance to speak. Now that's just rude, a disembodied voice echoed all around him. No more projection this time, just sound that followed him around wherever he went. We were having a conversation. There was a locked door in his way, so Zorian chucked one of his 3 remaining explosive cubes at it. It failed to work when he gave it a signal to explode. Sorry, but no explosions in my house, Sudamir's disembodied voice declared. Zorian frowned. Just like in the previous restart. And he had adjusted his explosive to try and counter the effect too. Worrying. By themselves, anti-explosion wards were nothing new. Every important building had them. Most of the time, though, they were just basic things that could not stand up to Zorian's craftsmanship. Sudamir's wards could not only counter his basic explosives, but also his specialized work that was expressly designed to work inside a heavily warded area. The ring failed to blow up. Maybe the wards worked on some exotic principle that totally shut down all spell formula-based explosives. To test that theory, he threw a bottle of liquid explosive, alchemically made and devoid of any fancy spell work, at the door in question. The bottle exploded as intended, sending dust and wooden splinters everywhere. So alchemy-based explosives still work. Good to know. Just how many expendables did you bring with you? Sudamir asked him through his voice spell. It must have cost a fortune. I'm flattered that you spent all that money on little old me, but is that really the best use of your resources? After that, the remaining undead in the mansion started attacking him again, trying to ambush him from nearby rooms as he tried to navigate the confusing inner layout of the mansion. They failed to actually hurt him, but they slowed his advance to a crawl and ended up being enough in the end. He literally ran out of time. The restart ended before he could track down Sudamir and confront him. Oh well, there was always next time. The next restart was largely similar to the previous one. He still contacted Deep Blue and the Luminous Advocates for mind magic instructions and largely spent the entire restart working on his mind magic. He did make a minor deviation at the start of the restart in order to visit the Ghost Serpent Acolytes, though. They told him the exact same thing they had in the previous restart: the ghost serpent says he's bad news and that he should go away. Trying to find out why he was bad news yielded no results. The spirit the web in question worshipped refused to say what about him was bad news. The very knowledge of what sort of bad news he was in itself bad news. He was the worst news. Bizarre. Well, disliking someone for no reason was no crime and, short of attacking the ghost serpent acolytes, there was nothing Zorian could do about the situation. And if he attacked them, then he was kind of vindicating the asshole spirit in a way, wasn't he? His lessons with the luminous advocates progressed at a rapid pace. By the end of the restart, he was ready to attempt to repair the matriarch's memory packet. It worked sort of. The packet wasn't exactly fixed, but he'd halted the degradation and bought himself another 2 months before it would start to decay again. That, the luminous advocates informed him, was the only thing that could really be done about a decaying foreign memory packet. You mentally stitch it together and it would hold for a time, but that process was in itself destructive to the packet, so there were only so many times one could repair it. Based on the size and condition of the matriarch's memory packet, the luminous advocates thought it could only be repaired one more time without risking its destruction. He had 2 more months to get better at memory packet repairs, after which he would get one more chance to buy some time. That meant that, depending on how good the second round of repairs went, he had about 4 or 5 more restarts at most to get good enough at interpreting Iranian memories to read the memories stored in the packet. He decided he had to get some experience with reading Iranian memories. Actually reading Iranian memories, not doing simplified exercises with Iranian tutors. Of course, neither the luminous advocates nor Deep Blue would agree to work with him on that, and he would bet that no other web could be talked into it either. No, that sort of thing was virtually always a hostile act, something you do to your enemies. So the solution was simple. He had to find some Iranian enemies. His first idea was to go after the sword divers. After all, they did try to ambush him once, and he still held a grudge about that, even if they didn't remember any of it. It even worked for a time. He managed to ambush several sword diver patrols and captured them for memory reading. His first 2 attempts to read the Iranian mind ended up about as well as his first attempt at reading human minds. That is, not well at all. He improved quickly, however, and soon found out some interesting things about sword divers. They had a habit of attacking vulnerable mages. It turned out they limited themselves to mages that tried to explore the dungeon beneath Corsa, and they were very careful about whom they targeted, but they were definitely willing to attack anyone they saw as an easy target. They also lived very deep in the dungeon, and any time they made the wrong person disappear, they just retreated from the surface layers until the searches and outrage died down. And that is what the sword divers did when they realized someone was targeting them. They flat out abandoned the dungeon beneath Corsa, retreating into the depths. Having read their minds, Zorian knew it would be weeks, perhaps months before they deigned to return, and he didn't dare follow after them. So he just looted their surface money stashes, more out of spite than because he really needed the cash, and went searching for more targets. He asked both Deep Blue and the luminous advocates if they knew an Iranian web they wouldn't mind being targeted. Surprisingly, it was the luminous advocates that were more interested. He expected Deep Blue to jump at the chance, considering their neighborhood, but they were actually pretty content with their current situation. They did offer him a job, however, one that they claimed would buy him pretty much anything he wanted out of them. Basically, they wanted him to get rid of the crystal ooze that was harassing their resource-gathering expeditions into the deeper parts of the dungeon. Crystal oozes were virtually immune to physical damage, quite fast, absorbed most forms of magical energy, could shoot arrow-like shards of crystal at things that annoyed them, and even a tiny prickle from one of their crystal blades and shards would rapidly turn a living being into a crystal statue. They were sometimes called crystal basilisks, and they were one of those nightmare monsters that nobody actually wanted to fight unless there was no choice. Deep Blue didn't seem very surprised when he declined their offer. As for the luminous advocates, they were apparently under constant threat from a web they called the Demon Skin Web or the Howling Ones. Those weren't their real names, but since that particular web refused to talk to any of the other ones and simply did the telepathic equivalent of screaming whenever someone tried to talk to them, the luminous advocates didn't know what to call them. The luminous advocates indicated they wouldn't mind to see them gone, or at least thinned out a bit. Well, by the end of the restart, Zorian had found out a lot of things about them. Such as that they called themselves challengers of the unspeakable, and were the so-called old Urania, the magicless, original webs that got conquered, assimilated or exterminated by the newer, magic-using webs originating from underneath Scioria. They had watched all their old neighbors fall before the tide of magic-using newcomers, either through violent conquest or through magic-using immigrants, until they were the only ones left. As far as they were concerned, it was the luminous advocates who were the demon skin web. Tragic, but challengers of the unspeakable were also violent killers that actively raided their neighbors, and even nearby human communities when they could get away with it. Zorian had no qualms about raiding them back. Finally, as the end of the restart approached, he started finalizing his preparations for another gate assault. This time his golem brigade would hopefully survive long enough to actually step into Ayaska Mansion along with him, giving him solid superiority over Sudamir's undead guards. As they say, third time's the charm. Far away from any established path or settlement, in a small artificial cave that Zorian had made to serve as his workshop and base of operations, there was a large wooden table. A mass of papers was strewn over it, and Zorian was staring at it with a small frown. The collection of scribbled notes and crude diagrams in front of him would no doubt look like a haphazard mess to the casual observer, but there was a pattern to the chaos. Zorian had spent a fair amount of time assembling the entire thing, and each piece of paper was exactly where he wanted it to be. Absent-mindedly tapping his pencil on the table, Zorian considered the information laid out in front of him. Everything he knew about Sudamir and Ayaska Mansion was there on the table, along with any other information he thought might be relevant for the upcoming gate assault. Truthfully, he already had a plan for the event, but it never hurt to double-check things, just in case he had forgotten something crucial. There were only 3 more days left until the summer festival, so if he wanted to make any significant changes to the plan, this was pretty much his last chance to do so. After his conversation with Sudamir in the previous restart, Zorian was now fairly sure that the man had his own goals he wanted to accomplish, and was effectively a third faction of the invasion force. He was not just being a loyal member of the cult of the World Dragon or sympathetic to the Abasins, he was hoping to gain something out of this endeavor, and it wasn't the same thing that the other 2 factions were fighting for. Sadly, he had been unable to figure out what Sudamir had been alluding to when he said he supported the invasion because of politics. That could mean anything. Really, there was no shortage of reasons why someone might want Scioria gone or taken down a peg. Sudamir might be trying to alter the internal balance of power within Eldamar to advance his pet cause, or trying to destroy Scioria's regional importance to boost the power of his own town and domain. He might be trying to weaken Eldamar as a whole on behalf of foreign interests, or he might simply want to distract the central government by destroying a major loyalist stronghold and giving them an external enemy to focus on. The possibilities were endless, and he had no way to narrow things down. Well, no way besides repeatedly invading Ayaska Mansion or attacking Sudamir directly. The former he was already doing, and the latter was hard to pull off. It was too easy for Sudamir to teleport away if Zorian decided to attack him on the job, and Zorian didn't know where the man went when not attending to his duties. Certainly not to his home in Nyazov Dveri, which was virtually abandoned most of the time. Knowing Zorian's luck, Sudamir was probably spending most of his time safely ensconced in Ayaska Mansion, which was essentially unassailable before the day of the invasion. No, his current way of going about things was definitely the correct one. Sudamir was never as vulnerable as he was on the day of the invasion, and not just because he foolishly sent virtually all of his forces to join the invasion and then left the obvious hole in his defenses completely unguarded. Ayaska Mansion was obviously more than just a secret base for Sudamir, otherwise he would have been far more willing to cut his losses and run in the previous restart. There was something he was unwilling to abandon, even after being metaphorically caught with his pants down and steadily backed into a corner. Zorian had a feeling that if he could find this mysterious something, he would solve the mystery of what Sudamir's real goals were easily enough. He spent several more minutes poring over the papers in front of him, considering and discarding various possibilities, before his eyes fell on the small cluster of notes dealing with Ayaska Mansion's warding scheme. His frown immediately deepened. Those wards worried him. His research told him there were several methods that Sudamir could have used to achieve the sort of reaction Zorian had experienced when he had tried to analyze the wards, but in all honesty, the most likely answer was that Sudamir had bound souls into the mansion's warding scheme. It seemed fairly obvious, considering Sudamir was clearly very necromancy-focused, and it would explain the weird ominous feelings he kept getting whenever the wards recognized him as an enemy. Most wards weren't so obvious about targeting someone. Another point in favor of such a theory was that Ayaska Mansion wasn't situated on a mana well, as far as Zorian could tell. He had spent several days wandering around the area where Ayaska Mansion was located, mapping the local geomantic web and dodging winter wolf patrols, and he had found no evidence of a convenient underground ley line that could be tapped into. In other words, Ayaska Mansion couldn't possibly support a warding scheme of any appreciable power. Not with conventional methods, anyway. Those souls continued producing mana, even after death. It was what made them so valuable to spiritual entities like demons and was one of the reasons why undead were so much more convenient to use than golems. It would take a lot of souls to power the sort of wards that Ayaska Mansion sported, but it could be done. And Sudamir clearly had no problems getting souls, considering how many undead guards he had at his disposal. Unfortunately, the illegal nature of soul magic made it difficult to gather solid information on its limitations and peculiarities. Even if he really was dealing with a creepy soul-powered house, Zorian had no idea what that meant for Sudamir's capabilities or how to exploit it. Coupled with the fact that Sudamir no doubt had some kind of last resort defense set up at the heart of his domain, and Zorian was feeling just a little bit uneasy about blithely walking in there without knowing more about what he was dealing with. Fortunately, he was a mage. He had a way of having his cake and eating it too. The basic idea came from seeing Sudamir's projection. Zorian couldn't really project himself through the mansion like that, since the wards would stop him, but he could pilot his golem army remotely. That would be very impractical for most mages, but he was a telepath, and a pretty damn good one at this point. All he had to do was install a bunch of telepathic relays into each golem, along with some moderately complex spell formula work to make them understand his telepathic commands. It worked well. No, it worked better than well. Maybe it was because he had animated the golems himself, and they thus had affinity to his own thoughts, but ordering them around telepathically was very fast and smooth, almost like controlling additional bodies. He could never achieve that sort of precision and coordination with verbal commands, and Zorian was wondering if there was any point in even bothering with conventional control methods in the future. Unless he was designing golems for someone else's use, verbal commands were only useful as a backup method for times when his telepathy was being disrupted. Unfortunately, there were some problems with his idea of simply throwing his golems at Sudamir and orchestrating things from relative safety. For one thing, the fact that he wasn't there personally meant he would be unable to use any magic to help them out. There was no way to cast spells remotely through his puppets, even his mind magic didn't extend beyond the golems themselves. He also wouldn't be able to activate his dispeller grenades and other spell items with mana pulses, which had necessitated a complete redesign of his arsenal into something cruder and less versatile. Finally, there was a fairly major issue of Sudamir seeing through his setup and disrupting his control over the golems. According to the books, that was the major reason why remote control schemes weren't more popular among mages. They were too easy to disrupt if the opponent knew what he was doing. Hopefully his solution to that problem would work. Come to think of it, he should probably check up on that now. Dropping his pen on the table with a small sigh, Zorian left the planning room, as he had dubbed it, and went to the crafting chamber where he assembled his golems and other equipment. Most of the golems were already done at this point, silently standing at the far end of the room where they wouldn't be in the way, awaiting orders. 6 golems, 2 of them big and bulky to soak up damage, and 4 smaller and faster ones to serve as a backbone of his little force. He extended his mind to them momentarily, testing their responsiveness to see if the control interface had degraded since their last test. It hadn't. Good. The first dozen or so versions had been very unstable, but it seemed he had ironed out all the flaws in the latest batch. He turned his attention to the reason he came here, his last, currently unfinished creation. It didn't look like much, in all honesty. Thin, almost skeletal, and yet smaller than even his 4 agility-focused combat golems. The animation core that powered it was likewise underwhelming. The golem in question couldn't do anything without constant, detailed instruction. It would be useless for just about any purpose except, hopefully, for the one that Zorian designed it for. Namely, for being his body double. The golem was specifically designed to mimic his size and proportions, with an animation core meant to synchronize with his telepathic orders as smoothly as possible. Magical sensors allowed Zorian to see and hear through it as through his own senses, and while he couldn't achieve the same amount of hand-eye coordination while using it as he could with his own body, it should be enough to throw around grenades and walk around well enough to pass as a human being. He glanced at the nearby alchemical container, where a syrupy pink liquid bubbled softly upon a carefully regulated fire. The artificial skin solution looked pretty much done to his eyes, but the recipe he had bought claimed the whole thing needed to simmer for at least another 15 minutes, so he left it alone for the moment, putting the golems through another round of tests to pass the time. Finally, once the 15 minutes had passed, he dumped the artificial skin solution over the golem and quickly started molding it into something resembling himself before it solidified and became unmodifiable. Half an hour later, he stood back to inspect his handiwork. It was kind of bad. The golem didn't really look like him much, or even entirely human, despite his best efforts. Either he sucked even more as a sculptor than he thought he did, or he should have taken the solution off the fire sooner, recipe be damned. But it was adequate. Really, some strategic goggles, heavy clothing, and maybe a large hat should be enough to hide the imperfections. It should look human enough to fool Sudamir, at least until he could face off with the necromancer in person, at which point the man's soul sight would allow him to see through any amount of disguise anyway. Hard to hide that the golem has no soul, after all. Oh well, even if the idea turned out to have been stupid and unnecessary in the end, he regretted nothing. He'd always wanted to make a body double of himself to offload some of his more annoying duties onto, and this seemed like a step in the right direction. Animation spells could get scarily intelligent at the highest levels of sophistication, so it should be possible to design a look-alike golem that could pass casual inspection and pose as him. Looking at the misshapen thing in front of him, though, Zorian knew he was quite far from being able to create something like that. He'd never be able to skip family gatherings with this. By now, the gate assault had become something of a routine for Zorian. He dealt with the Abasin defenders virtually flawlessly, the only complication being that the pair of cave drakes he'd used as a distraction had fallen a little too quickly for Zorian's liking. They were big and tough, but apparently hordes of weaker opponents were a better choice for keeping the defenders busy until he could secure the gate. Still, all of his golems had survived the attack on the Abasin base, and most of his spell item stockpile was still unspent, so Zorian considered the first phase of the attack a success. With the gate secure, the real operation could begin. He pushed the unconscious body of one of the Abasins through the gate to fool the mansion's wards into thinking the incursion was authorized, and then stepped through, his golem battlegroup trailing behind him. The plan was simple. Zorian would remain in the gate room, guarded by one of the big golems, while the rest of his force would be sent deeper into the mansion to confront Sudamir. Zorian would be essentially projecting himself through the smallest, most human-looking golem, occasionally giving the rest of the golems superfluous verbal commands to complete the illusion. Hopefully this would fool Sudamir into thinking he was dealing with 2 human invaders, one of whom was just guarding the gate while the other one led a force of golems deeper into his domain, rather than just one human that was directing the golems remotely. Not only should it keep Sudamir from trying to disrupt Zorian's remote control, it should also keep Sudamir's attention firmly on the advancing golems and reduce the chance of him sending his forces around to strike at real Zorian. The first surprise came when his golems had reached the spot where the wards had turned on him in the previous restart. This time they didn't activate. Strange. After thinking about it for a while, Zorian decided it was probably because none of the golems had souls. The detection wards were probably soul-based, just like everything else in this house. Sadly, that only delayed the problem, as he soon encountered a locked door he had to go through to keep advancing. The golem Zorian was puppeteering didn't have anything to pick the lock with, and even if it had, it lacked the manual dexterity to perform something as finicky as lock-picking, so he just ordered the big golem to smash the door aside. Unsurprisingly, that proved too much for the wards to ignore, and they immediately turned hostile. Zorian ordered the golem group forward, trying to get them as close to the mansion's center as possible before Sudamir scrambled his undead forces and tried to intercept them. Curiously, the dimensional gate stayed open, despite the activation of the wards. Zorian could feel the wards' agitation as they realized he was a threat and intensified around him, but even though he triggered the wards in such a brazen manner, even though he was right there in the gate room, the dimensional opening refused to close shut. Obviously triggering the wards outside the actual gate room sidestepped the automatic shutdown contingency, but that sounded like such a silly oversight that Zorian couldn't help but think Sudamir wanted things to work like that. Surely a warding expert like Sudamir wouldn't make that sort of mistake. And even if he did, he almost certainly had a way to shut down the gate on his own initiative, independent of any automatic shutdown. What was he missing here? Why would Sudamir want the gate to remain open, even if he had intruders inside his mansion? Well, whatever. Only one way to find out. The golems pressed onwards, even as the first waves of undead began to crash into them. Zorian had plenty of spell items to burn this time, so he used them quite liberally on the attackers to great effect. His advance was steady and unstoppable, and the attacks on his golem group became increasingly frantic and disorganized as time went by. Sudamir hadn't even tried to contact him, in person or via projection. There were far less traps than Zorian expected there would be, though in retrospect it made a lot of sense that Sudamir wouldn't seed his corridors with explosives and other destructive effects. Nobody wanted their possessions trashed by their own defenses, and the mansion was usually filled to the brim with guards anyway. When Zorian did finally encounter a real trap, it came in the form of a gas trap that rapidly filled an entire hallway with thick, yellow smoke. Considering that the gas had no effect on his golems and that the activation of the trap was soon followed by one last attack by the mansion's undead defenders, Zorian guessed that the gas was poisonous. It was a pretty good way to debilitate unprepared living foes while leaving the undead boars and warriors unaffected. The smoke also reduced visibility for anyone relying on regular sight, while the undead didn't seem affected by the resulting visibility issues. Sudamir had clearly put in his all into this one last attack, even sending a pair of flesh golems to reinforce the more familiar boars and black-clad human corpses. The flesh golems managed to destroy two of his smaller golems before being torn apart, but the result was never really in doubt. The undead were destroyed and Zorian broke through the last door standing between him and his destination. The golem he was puppeteering stepped into the heart of Ayaska Mansion, and the sight honestly left Zorian speechless. The room was large and cylindrical, with every inch of the walls covered with spell formula glyphs. Rather than being simply etched or painted on, however, the glyphs were made out of a shiny, silvery metal embedded into the walls. The really eye-catching thing, though, was the massive crystalline cylinder placed into the exact center of the room. It stretched from floor to ceiling, affixed to them via stone bases and thick metal bands, and emanated a soft blue glow that dimmed and brightened in a slow, regular pattern. Like a gigantic, glowing, cylindrical heart. Zorian stared at the glowing pillar and the glyph-covered wall in silence, wondering what the hell he'd stepped into. He had expected to find something interesting here, yes, but the sheer scale of the thing in front of him was rather intimidating. Beautiful, isn't it? Sudamir said, stepping from behind the pillar. It took me years to build all of this. It's a work of love, and I'd really hate to see it damaged. So be a little careful with those explosives you are toting around here, okay? The cylinder is a soul storage device, isn't it? Zorian spoke through the golem. That's how you're powering the wards in this place. There must be hundreds of souls trapped there. A soul storage device. Sudamir repeated, sounding quite outraged. His left hand twitched uncontrollably for a second before Sudamir used his other hand to still its movements. You think all of this is just? He burst into laughter, like he'd just heard a very amusing joke. Was it just Zorian, or did Sudamir sound just a little bit unhinged this time? My dear, foolish, uninvited guest, you have no idea what you have stumbled upon here, do you? Look around you, said Sudamir, making a sweeping gesture with his hands to indicate at the room they were standing in. Do you really think this place is just a simple soul storage device? No, no, my friend, what you are looking at is a veritable well of souls containing thousands of spiritual essences, and with enough room for 1,000,000 more. 1,000,000 souls? Zorian asked incredulously. Come on now, Sudamir, how would you even gather that many souls in a timely manner? Scioria has almost 500,000 people, Sudamir said, shrugging lightly. If the attack on Scioria goes as planned, most of them are going to die tonight. They will then go here to join the ones I've already gathered. He knocked on the crystal pillar lightly for emphasis. What? Asked Zorian, a horrifying realization dawning on him. Oh yes, this place, began Sudamir, spinning in place with his hands outstretched. This is the equivalent of an antlion pit for souls. Everyone who dies in the vicinity of Ayaska Mansion has their soul drawn here and trapped in the well. Normally, that doesn't mean much, since we're in the middle of nowhere. But now. The gate, Zorian said. It allows you to extend your soul trap over the city while the Abasins go about killing people. That's why you haven't closed the gate, even after you realized you were under attack. Every moment that the gate spends closed is a moment during which souls are not flowing into the well, Sudamir said. And, you see, there were no more attackers pouring in by the time I noticed the intrusion. Only you two, or perhaps just one. I can't see a soul on you. You didn't react at all when I flooded the corridor with breath-stealer gas, either. Not to mention how suspiciously passive the mage next to the gate is. You're some kind of fancy projection, aren't you? Before Zorian could say anything, Sudamir started laughing again, loudly and hysterically, his hands twitching and clenching in a disturbing manner. Zorian was pretty sure at this point that there was something very wrong with Sudamir. He had triggered some pretty radical change in the necromancer with his successful invasion. The laughter, the twitching, the unusual candidness of his responses. Sudamir looked almost drugged. Did he panic in the face of the crisis and take some ill-advised enhancement potion? Or maybe perform some spell with severe side effects? Whatever the answer, Sudamir was steadily becoming more unstable as the conversation progressed, and Zorian didn't think he would get much more out of him. Why? Why? Sudamir screamed suddenly, instantly transitioning from laughter to overdramatic despair. His skin writhed like snakes were swimming through his flesh, and his eyes began to shine with a soft blue glow. Yup, he'd definitely panicked and done something stupid. Why did you come here? Everything was going so well, so perfectly. All those years of planning, all the sacrifices I made, I won't let you take it all away from me. I won't, I won't, I won't, I won't. Zorian ordered his golems to attack the man, but he had made his move far too late. Before the golems could reach him, Sudamir's body rapidly expanded and twisted, transforming into a huge humanoid monster. It was green, vaguely reptilian, and had small, vestigial wings growing out of its back like a cross between a troll and dragon. The golems he'd ordered to attack Sudamir kept charging at their target, undaunted by the transformation, but the creature was stronger and more agile than Zorian's creations. It probably was part troll, too, because it definitely regenerated like one when wounded. It did not take long for the smaller golems to be reduced to scrap, and the big golem wasn't doing so well either. Zorian was just about to hit it with every spell item he had left when he found out that the troll dragon thing could breathe fire too. The poor golem he was following didn't last a second under the heat before failing. The big golem disappeared from his control less than a minute later. Knowing that he had no chance against this transformed, berserk version of Sudamir, Zorian stepped back into the Abasin base on the other side of the dimensional gate and then tried to analyze the gate to see how it worked. Predictably, the gate soon detected his tampering and shut itself down. Of course. He kind of figured that would happen. Well, at least that way Sudamir couldn't get to him, and he'd also located one of the traps Quadakikl had placed on the gate to prevent tampering with it. It would take a fair number of restarts, but he felt he could locate and dismantle the protection on the gate with a bit of trial and error. He didn't have much time to consider things, though, because Quadakikl showed up soon after the gate closed to see what was happening. Zorian activated his restart switch rather than confront him. At the start of the next restart, once he had a chance to calm down and think about things, Zorian decided that Sudamir had to be dealt with somehow. Originally he'd gone after the man because he had seemed like an easier target than the Abasin leaders and probably knew a lot of their sensitive secrets, but the revelation about his soul-gathering operation really disturbed Zorian. He had no idea what one would need hundreds of thousands of souls for, but it couldn't possibly be good. Politics, he'd said. Humph. Still, this soul trap of his, it should be very obvious to someone who knew what to look for. Large-scale magic like that couldn't be hidden easily. Was that why Sudamir had gotten rid of every soul mage in the region? So they couldn't stumble upon his twisted masterpiece and report him to the government? If so, then dealing with Sudamir might simply be a matter of reporting the man to central authorities and having them deal with everything. He didn't need this kind of distraction at the moment, though the Matriarch's memory package was steadily degrading and he was running out of time. Thus, for the next 2 restarts he continued doing what he had been doing thus far, visiting Iranian webs in order to learn more about memory packets and the Iranian mind. He still made 2 gate assaults at the end of each restart, but he no longer tried to access the soul well in the center of the mansion. He didn't see the point. He completely lacked the expertise to make sense of that thing, so he doubted he would learn anything from studying it. Instead, he simply explored the rest of the mansion, building a map of the place and trying to see if there was anything else interesting about it. He didn't find much, though. Certainly nothing that could compare with the soul trap in the central room. He also tried to make sense of the teardrop pendants the Abasins wore around their necks, also without much luck. Analyzing them did not bring down Quadakikl's wrath on him like he had feared, but there was nothing there to indicate he was holding a functional keystone. The only thing he could think of was that the material itself was perhaps the key. Zorian couldn't identify it, and it was totally indestructible to casual efforts. It kind of reminded him of Quadakikl's skeleton, which was also black in color and incredibly resistant to damage. Although the luminous advocates remained his primary Iranian teachers in these 2 restarts, he also checked out the 8 webs he was referred to by the Silent Doorway adepts. Sadly, only 3 of those were in any way useful to him: the Mind Temple, Perfect Phantasm Crafters and Adherents of Contemplation. Zorian chose to learn from the Mind Temple in the first restart and the Perfect Phantasm Crafters in the second one. The Adherents of Contemplation were too fond of riddles and non-answers for his taste. The Mind Temple were all about memory, though more focused on honing and organizing their own memories than reading and modifying other people's ones. Still, they had quite a lot of expertise when it came to memory packets, even if what they taught him was centered more about him making his own memory packets than repairing foreign ones. His skills at making memory packets were good enough by now that he would never really forget anything he specifically tried to remember. If nothing else, that should drastically reduce the number of notebooks he had to write and store at the end of each restart. The alteration method was still useful for transferring other people's notes across the restart, such as Kale's research, but most of his own needs were now better served by directly organizing his memories with mind magic. The Perfect Phantasm Crafters had a very indicative name. They specialized in making illusions ones made out of real sound and light, as well as simple tricks of the mind. They couldn't really help him with his memory package problem, but Zorian would also have to actually interpret the information inside the package once he opened it, and perfect phantasm crafters knew a lot about the difference between human and Iranian minds. They had to, if they wanted their illusions to work on humans. However, as helpful as the perfect phantasm crafters were in that regard, there was ultimately only one thing that consistently helped him to understand Iranian thoughts: beating up Irania unconscious and forcibly rooting through their minds. Even getting Lukav to make him an Irania transformation potion and assuming their shape for a few hours hadn't helped him as much. At the end of the second restart, he tried repairing the Matriarch's memory package again. It was the last time he would be able to extend the deadline, and he was hoping to get 4 or 5 extra months before he had to open it. Instead, he got 3. Damn it. Though he had only 3 more months until he had to open the Matriarch's memory packet, Zorian decided to stop seeking lessons from the Irania and simply go back to Syoria, taking Curiel with him as usual. There was no point in seeking the lessons at the moment, since he could no longer repair the packet, and the only thing that could really improve his ability to understand it was attacking Irania and reading their minds. He didn't need to set aside an entire restart to do that. Besides, he wanted to ask Kale about his opinion of Sudamir and his operations, since the Morlock was the only friendly necromancer that Zorian knew. He didn't tell Kale about Sudamir and his soul trap immediately, though that was bound to be rather upsetting to the boy, considering that a lot of Kale's friends and acquaintances were killed by Sudamir and probably ended up in that soul well of his. Not really the best topic to broach just after you told someone all about the time loop and the Abasan invasion that was going to hit the city in less than a month. He would let Kale browse through his notebooks in peace for now and broach the subject later. Unfortunately, coming back to Syoria meant that he had to suffer through Svim's stupid exercise sessions again. Levitate these marbles, make them glow different colors, assemble them into different shapes. So boring. Wait. Fuse 2 marbles together. What? Svim usually didn't give him any alteration-based shaping exercises during these sessions. But no matter, he had already tried that shaping exercise on his own, so it was still trivial to perform it. Svim frowned at him. Should he be worried or celebrate that he induced that kind of reaction out in the usually imperturbable man? Worried, it turned out. Svim's demands immediately became atypical following that. Zorian was told to levitate water, to freeze it solid, to make a perfect cube out of ice and then quickly cut it in half without shattering it, to reshape a coin, to burn images into wooden panels, to make a coin spin, to shape candle wax, to hold his hand over a candle flame without getting burnt, to make dice fall on one specific side Svim called out, to repair a damaged watch, to wilt a flower, to teleport a snail. Quite a few exercises were utterly beyond Zorian, especially the latter ones. Others he could do, but not with the surety that he knew Svim demanded of his charges. And yet, Svim did not triumphantly stop once he'd found something that Zorian was incapable of and then tell him to practice that until he got it right. Instead he just moved on to something else, apparently just testing him to see where his limits were. Tell me honestly, Svim said. Are you truly Zorian Kaczynski? Yes. Zorian said, baffled. Why would you ask that? You are too good, Svim told him bluntly. What? Now he decided he was too good at this. Bizarre. What did he do to perturb Svim so much? He couldn't really remember doing anything more impressive than usual. I'll take that as a compliment, Zorian said. I am definitely Zorian Kaczynski, though, no doubt about it. Then how do you explain your shaping skills? Svim asked. They are completely implausible for your age and known background. No matter how talented you may be, your shaping skills are just too thorough to be anything but a product of years of practice. I started early, Zorian tried. Svim gave him an unamused look. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, Mr. Kaczynski, Svim said with a sigh. I know it was me who taught you those shaping skills you are currently displaying. Not all of them, but definitely the ones that you have learned properly. Not only do you display some tells that I don't think anyone other than me would have taught you, but you also seem to know me well enough to anticipate my requests before I even speak them. Oops. He hadn't even realized he'd been doing that. The thing is, Mr. Kaczynski, said Svim, leaning forward and fixing him with a small glare, I don't remember ever teaching you. And I assure you that I have a very good memory. I would like an explanation, if you don't mind. Zorian was silent for nearly a minute, thinking of how to answer that. He could just play dumb, but he had a feeling that Svim wouldn't let this go, and the most likely explanation for the confusion was that Zorian had used mind magic on Svim in the past. Considering that he was, in fact, a highly capable mind mage, and that this would be hard to hide under determined scrutiny, it was in his best interest not to let things degenerate into actual legal investigation. He could just hit the restart switch and start over, but that felt a little excessive at this point. He could always do that later if the situation continued to deteriorate. Plus, activating the switch so early in the restart might bring unwanted attention from Zack and Red Robe. Would it be so bad if he told Svim the truth? The man knew how to protect his mind, and probably wouldn't go around telling everyone who would listen that his student claimed he was a time traveler. As much as Svim annoyed him, he was a capable adult mage that clearly knew a lot about limitations of magic and how to go about developing it. He could be quite useful if he could convince him he was telling the truth. I'm waiting, Mr. Kaczynski, Svim said. All right, Zorian relented. The truth is that we're all trapped in a time loop of sorts. The whole month leading up to the summer festival repeats itself endlessly, but most people forget everything that happened when time resets itself. But some people remember, and I am one of them. Svim listened to Zorian's story in silence, neither asking questions nor professing disbelief. Zorian didn't tell the man everything. Of course he said nothing about the invasion that happened at the end of the restart, for instance, and he kept information about himself and his abilities to a minimum. Definitely not telling the man who suspected him of messing with his mind that he was more than capable of doing just that. Eventually, Zorian's explanation wound down and silence descended upon the room. Svim seemed to be lost in thought for the moment, and Zorian was content to wait for the man's reaction. So, Svim said eventually. You are saying that we have been having these practice sessions for several years now, except that I forget all about them every few weeks. Yes, Zorian confirmed. That must have been a miserable experience for you, then, Svim observed candidly. Zorian fumbled, unsure how to respond to that. I am still not sure whether to believe you about all this, Svim said. It seems quite unbelievable. However, assuming you are indeed telling the truth, I feel compelled to apologize for the actions of my previous selves. You see, I make it a point to be very demanding with my charges for the first month or two of our mentorship. What? What? Zorian asked incredulously, scarcely believing what he was hearing. It builds character and weeds out the unfit, said Svim, giving him an unrepentant shrug. Moreover, most of the students being sent my way need to be humbled somewhat, for their own good. Unfortunately, time loop does not play well with such ploys. I wouldn't have put you through several years of that kind of treatment if I had any control over the situation. Zorian was torn between wanting to laugh and slugging the man in the face. He subjected every student to several months of being an utter jerk as a test of character. That was so stupid. How could he possibly think that was a reasonable thing to do? I cannot possibly put into words how much I want to hit you right now, he told Svim seriously. We'll talk about expanding your vocabulary later, Svim told him dismissively, before depositing a pen and a piece of paper in front of him. For now, please list a few things I can check to confirm your story. Shooting Svim one last glare, Zorian picked up the pen and started writing. This was going to be one long restart, he could already tell. Time travel was a hard thing to prove. It was known to be impossible among mages, and proof to the contrary usually boiled down to possession of impossible knowledge and skills. Unfortunately, that often simply wasn't convincing enough. There existed a nigh-infinite number of ways to gather information with magic, none of which required time travel, and impossible skills could just as easily mean you were not who you claimed you were. There was little that Zorian could tell Svim that couldn't be explained with something more mundane than time travel. Still, while Zorian had no idea whether Svim was actually going to accept his story, he was confident that the information he'd written down on the sheet of paper in front of him would at least give the man some pause. The restarts varied greatly in how they developed, but some things always remained the same, which meant that Zorian could give Svim a multitude of small predictions about the upcoming days. Things like what was going to be written in the newspapers, what magical stores would announce special sales in preparation for the summer festival, and what students would end up leaving the academy because of the monster incursions. It helped that it had been less than a week since the restart had begun, so events didn't have the time to diverge too much yet. Individually, each of the things he'd written were easy to explain. When taken as a whole, he would have to be the best damn spy in the whole city to acquire that kind of information, and it still wouldn't explain how he'd known about some of the more sudden events on the list. He handed the list to Svim, who quickly scanned it and then pocketed it with a silent nod. He told Zorian that he would try to verify his claims over the weekend and that Zorian should visit him again on Monday. And that was that. A decent outcome, all things considered. Zorian halfway expected Svim to criticize his penmanship and tell him to start over and write properly this time around. He bid Svim goodbye and left. He was in the process of walking back home, idly trying to think of a good way to broach the topic of Sudamir's soul well to Kale, when he spotted a green-haired girl waving at him in the distance. Surprised and distracted as he was, it took him several seconds to realize who he was looking at, even though green hair was pretty damn rare and therefore a huge giveaway. It was Capriva Reed, one of his classmates. He waved back uncertainly, wondering what that was about. It was common courtesy to greet your classmates when you meet them outside the academy, of course, but this wasn't the first time Zorian had encountered Capriva outside the academy, and she had never reacted like this in the past. She'd give him a nod if they passed each other by or say hello if he did it first, but never try to attract his attention like she just had. Which made sense, really. She was almost a total stranger to him, just like most of his classmates. So why was she? Oh. Never mind, he was going to find out what she wanted soon enough. She was crossing the street and making a beeline towards him. Zorian studied her as she approached, trying to see if he was in some kind of trouble. He felt no hostility or apprehension emanating from her, so probably not, but Capriva always kind of intimidated him. Less so since he got stuck in the time loop before. He used to actively avoid her whenever possible, but even in his current situation he'd rather not tangle with someone from House Reed. He was still vulnerable to being drugged senseless, and that was kind of their specialty. He clearly wasn't the only one who found her intimidating, either. She was a tall, shapely girl, something Zorian could attest to at the moment, what with her getting ever closer to his position, but very few people had tried to court her over the years. Even Benesek refrained from making a pass on her, which was pretty damn amazing. Zorian was pretty sure that Akoja was the only other girl in their class who Benesek had never tried to flirt with. "Zorian, you can't believe how glad I am to see you here," she said once she'd finally gotten close enough. He raised his eyebrows at the statement. "You live together with Kale, right?" "Yes," he confirmed, curious what that had to do with anything. "Good. I agreed to meet with him about a business deal today, and he gave me the directions to this, Amaya's place, where you two live, but I seem to be misremembering something because I can't find it," she said. "Could you give me some directions here? I can do better. I'm on my way there myself, so if you don't mind I can just walk you there," he said. "Great. I was hoping you would say that," she grinned at him. "Lead the way, then. And don't mention to anyone that I got lost, okay? That was pretty freaking embarrassing. I don't know how I messed up so badly. If Kale asks, we just met on the way by accident. Kind of true, anyway." Zorian nodded in acceptance and they both set off towards Amaya's place. He couldn't help but frown at Capriva slightly, though. Business deal? Was this what he thought it was? Unfortunately, Capriva noticed the look and misconstrued its meaning. What's that look for? She asked defensively. You don't approve of me coming to your place or something? It's not like that, Zorian assured her hurriedly. Man, she was prickly. It's just that when Kale told me he was going to find someone to buy those rare alchemical ingredients from, I didn't expect this to be the result. I thought he would go to someone well, older. When Kale had told Zorian that he had to get a hold of a fair amount of normally restricted alchemical ingredients to continue with his research, Zorian had thought the Morlock would go to some shady shop or something, not try to broker a deal with one of their classmates. Then again, Zorian had to admit that the idea wasn't stupid as such. House Reed, of which Capriva was a member, specialized in growing magical plants and processing them into alchemical ingredients. It was also a public secret that they were heavily involved in the sale of drugs and illegal alchemy products in general, and through that maintained deep links with organized crime groups. There was a highly publicized trial against the house a few years back, since several smuggling rings were found to be led by exiled members of the house, but nothing came out of it in the end. House Reed was responsible for a sizable proportion of Eldamar's herb fields, greenhouses and forest preserves, some of which nobody except House Reed knew how to tend to, so the government wasn't willing to antagonize them too much. So yes, there was some logic to Kale approaching Capriva to acquire the needed ingredients, though Zorian was still very surprised it had worked. He would have expected Capriva to act outraged at the implication that she was engaged in criminal activities, fearing some kind of trick. That's what Zorian would have done in her place. He would have to ask Kale how he had done it later, just in case there was some secret to it that he should know about. He did intend to make use of criminal networks himself in the near future, after all. Wait, you're in on that? She asked, surprised. Yeah. We're in a partnership of sorts, Zorian said. Huh, she said, giving him a speculative look. I would have never guessed you were involved in something like this. You just seem so straight-laced, you know. Then again, you're a pretty driven guy, and my grandfather always said that nobody ever got powerful by following the law. Such sage wisdom from the older generation. To tell the truth, I would have never guessed you'd be involved in something like this either, Zorian said. I mean, weren't you annoyed when Kale approached you about this? Doesn't it bother you that one of your fellow students automatically assumed you were involved in your family's other business simply because you're part of House Reed? She snorted derisively. Everyone assumes that anyway, she said. They're just too polite to say it out loud. At least most of the time. Besides, I made some uncharitable assumptions about him. As well. I wouldn't have acknowledged any random offer, you know. If you had been the one to approach me, I would have told you to go to hell. And possibly punched you, if you didn't back off after that. But since Kale is a Morlock, I assumed his offer is actually genuine. Morlocks have a reputation of their own, you know. Ah. So that's why it had worked so easily. Capriva then tried to talk him into telling her what he and Kale needed so much restricted material for and how they had gotten the money to pay for it. Zorian actually answered the first, saying it was for benign medical research, totally true, unless Kale was misleading him, but refused to answer questions about the money. He took the chance to ask her if she was planning on reporting them to someone, reading her surface thoughts to make sure she was telling the truth. She denied that truthfully, as far as he could tell, and seemed more amused than insulted by the accusation. She didn't really believe they wanted the materials for medical research, though. Zorian didn't bother convincing her he was telling the truth. After that, the conversation shifted to other, more casual topics. Mostly academy-related, as that was a relatively inoffensive subject, but Capriva sometimes pried into his private life when she saw a convenient opportunity to do so. It was interesting, as she hadn't been this talkative in the previous restarts when she joined his combat magic group. Eventually they reached their destination, at which point Capriva met Amaya. His landlord had either never heard of House Reed or had an even better poker face than Zorian had thought, because she looked positively overjoyed about Capriva's visit. She insisted that Zorian was rude not to offer Capriva something to eat and drink before dragging her away to hash out a deal. Food before work, Amaya said in a lecturing voice. That's the rule. Since Capriva seemed actually excited at the prospect of eating some homemade cookies, Zorian went along with it. He wasn't in that much of a hurry. He really shouldn't have been surprised when Capriva asked Amaya for a glass of beer, or when Amaya gave them both a glass in response. He covertly transmuted the liquid into something non-alcoholic while they weren't looking, but that just made the stuff taste even viler than it usually did, so he may have shot himself in the foot there. In the end, while the deal was successfully concluded, what was supposed to be a relatively short visit ended up taking most of the afternoon. Capriva even ended up meeting Kiriel, with whom she got along surprisingly well. He would have to talk to his sister later about what was acceptable for conversation around the green-haired girl, since Capriva said she would drop by again next week to deliver the materials. He should probably have a talk with Amaya as well, just in case the older woman really had no idea who she was dealing with. Ultimately, though, Zorian did not worry about the whole thing too much. The deal was largely arranged by Kale, with Zorian's role being mainly to pay for it all. As such, he felt it was only proper to let the Morlock boy take care of it while Zorian focused on something else. Gods knew he had too many things vying for his time as it was. Zorian's plan for the weekend consisted of 2 solid days of Arania fighting and accompanying memory reading to practice for the eventual opening of the Matriarch's memory packet. Sadly, the plan didn't survive collision with reality. His first target, the burning apex web in the vicinity of Scioria, turned out to be a rather poor choice for aggression. They were a martially inclined web, proficient in both magic and mental combat, and had spent most of their existence in fierce competition with the neighboring webs. The patrol he ambushed seemed like easy targets to him, but they ended up being anything but. They worked together flawlessly, had some sort of mental attack that could partially pass through his mental barriers, and had prepared the battlefield beforehand. They ended up maneuvering him into a pre-existing explosion trap and detonated a boulder right next to him. He managed to shield himself against the bulk of the blast, but he still ended up with a severely wounded arm and a multitude of minor scrapes. Plus he had a raging headache from when he failed to shield against their telepathic attacks properly. He activated his recall stone and fled. The damage was nothing really serious, he later found out, but it would take several days before he was completely healed, even with the healing potions that Kale was supplying him. Since embarking on further campaigns against the Arania while in less than top form struck him as a terrible idea, his plans would have to be delayed. Damn it. At least Kale was happy. Ever since he had found out that Zorian could teleport all over the country as he pleased, he had been trying to talk Zorian into taking him to the northern wilderness so he could gather herbs, mushrooms and other materials for his research. Zorian had been decidedly against it, considering it to be a waste of time, but since his plan was already shot to hell and he couldn't do much at the moment, he figured he would grant Kale's wish just this once. Accordingly, Sunday found Zorian wandering around the forest with Kale. Zorian had expected his role would be to simply teleport Kale around and protect him from anything that sought to kill them, but Kale was feeling talkative that day and insisted on explaining everything he was doing to Zorian. Every time they encountered one of the plants Kale was looking for, the Morlock boy told him why the plant could be found in that particular place, what it was useful for, and how to harvest the plant correctly. All of which was very important information that was not easy to get a hold of. One could not find this sort of thing in most books, as people were reluctant to share this sort of information. It was all too easy to overharvest specific magical plants if too many people were doing it, so there was a tendency among herbalists to guard their secrets tightly and only pass them on to their apprentices. Even so, quite a few magical plants went totally extinct over the centuries due to unchecked exploitation, making potions they were used for impossible to make in modern times. So yes, it was a good thing to know all this. And yet, I still don't see why you wanted to do this so badly, Zorian complained as he used a knife to harvest some sort of river grass. The thing was tricky to harvest correctly, since one had to cut it quickly and in exactly the right place or its alchemical properties would be completely ruined. Not an easy thing to do with one wounded hand. We could have just bought all of this in a store and saved ourselves so much time. Yes, I know it would have been rather expensive, but I could afford it. Easily. Money is less of a problem for me than time. I'm afraid you are wrong, Kale said, shaking his head. The Morlock boy was crouching not too far from Zorian, staring at a large boulder like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Zorian felt the urge to ask Kale what the hell was so interesting about that rock, but eventually decided he didn't want to know. The things we are gathering are very hard to find in a store. They tend to be snapped up by wealthy, influential alchemists who buy them straight from the people who gather them in the wild. They never reach the shelves. Really? Zorian asked, surprised. Strange. You'd think someone would just start cultivating them if they're in such high demand. You know, like House Reed and so many others are already doing for other useful magical plants. Not every plant can be grown in controlled conditions, Kale told him. Many of them cannot survive outside their natural environment for whatever reason, and that environment is either impossible or uneconomical to mimic artificially. Others will grow just fine, but will lose whatever essence makes them useful if not taken care of in just the right way or exposed to very specific conditions. Some of them can be transplanted into gardens and survive, but will never grow or reproduce afterwards. Some of them grow so slowly that nobody can be actually bothered to wait for them to grow to maturity. Okay, I get it, Zorian said, interrupting his lecture. Magical plants are very hard to domesticate. I actually knew that already, but the ones we're gathering just don't seem all that special to me, you know. But if you say otherwise, I will take your word for it. I'm not a botanical expert by any means. Neither am I, but I do know a few things about the topic. My adoptive mother insisted I had to know these things if I wanted to be a real alchemist, Kale said, rising to his feet and discarding the clump of moss he had been scrutinizing up until a moment ago. Are you done with those? Do you need some help? Here, Zorian said, handing Kale the river grass he harvested. I think I got all of them correctly, but you should probably check to make sure. Kale glanced at the small bundle in Zorian's hands and immediately discarded 3 of the stalks that Zorian had apparently ruined without realizing it. How Kale could recognize that on first sight, Zorian had no idea. We're done here, I think, Kale said, looking around for a second. I don't think we'll find anything else here without a lot of walking around. Do you think you can teleport us to the next section of the forest now? Sure. My mana reserves were replenished a while ago, Zorian said. Let's go then. Deeper into the wilderness this time around. We haven't been attacked by anything truly dangerous the entire day, and I want to see if I can find some ghost ivy or moonflowers, Kale said, gesturing northward. Zorian nodded, unperturbed by the somewhat increased danger. While there were quite a few creatures that could kill them that deep in the forest, he should be able to notice them in time and teleport them to safety. A minute later they popped over to their new destination and Kale started looking around to assess their surroundings. Teleporting is so very convenient, the white-haired boy commented. I can't wait to learn how to do that. How long do you think it would take me to learn how to teleport like that? I don't know. A year or 2? Zorian speculated. If you work hard on your shaping skills, that is. As little as a couple of months if you work with me to create a training regimen for you like I'm doing for Taven. Ha! I might take you up on that at some point, he said. I'm wasting a lot of your time and nerves as it is, though, and I don't want to be greedy. You've been a lot of help over the restarts, Zorian assured him. You've earned some consideration from me, as far as I'm concerned. I see, Kale said speculatively. In that case, I'd like to pester you a little about those disappearances happening around Nyazov Dveri. Many of these people had been my friends and acquaintances, and their fate rests rather heavily on my mind. I know you have been busy in these past few restarts, but did you perhaps look into the matter at some point? Well, he hadn't planned on having this talk during this particular outing, but he supposed this was as good a moment as any to tell Kale about Sudamir's soul trap thingy. Actually, about that. Zorian had fully expected Kale to freak out when he heard what Sudamir was doing in his isolated forest mansion, and he was not disappointed in that regard. If anything, Zorian greatly underestimated how furious the Morlock boy would be by the end of the story. Kale, in a rather stunning display of recklessness, wanted them to go visit Ayaska Mansion immediately so he could inspect Sudamir's soul trap. It took almost an hour for Zorian to convince the other boy that this was a spectacularly bad idea. Zorian was still wounded, Kale was not thinking straight, and neither of them had done any preparations for such an expedition. You realize what this means, right? Kale asked him. It was apparently a rhetorical question because Kale immediately answered it himself. Every one of those times you died during the invasion, your soul was likely sucked into that thing along with everyone else's. Yeah, so? Asked Zorian. The time loop mechanism clearly doesn't care about that. It just plucks my soul out of the pillar and goes on to do its thing like usual. Though now that Zorian thought about it, that in itself might be a clue as to how the time loop really functioned. It could be that the time loop mechanism was just so powerful that it could casually extract his soul out of a giant soul prison that probably had a million safeguards against someone doing that very thing, but it could also be that the way it all worked just sort of sidestepped the problem. If the time loop really destroyed everything whenever it rolled back time, it might not really matter where his soul ended up in the end, so long as it's still intact. Yes, and the collection process is apparently sufficiently benign that you have suffered no soul damage from being exposed to it multiple times, Kale said. That's good to know, at least. It definitely put some of my fears to rest. But Zorian, I am honestly not sure how much I can help you with this. When you really get down to it, I'm really just a dabbler in soul magic, and Sudamir is clearly an expert at the field. He has also delved deep into areas of soul magic that I wouldn't have even touched, so even if I were an expert I might not have been of any help. I'll see what I can find out in the next couple of days, but in all likelihood you're going to have to find someone else to help you deal with Sudamir. I don't suppose you have any recommendations? Zorian tried. I already gave you a list of people I know who dabbled in soul magic and, well, Sudamir already got most of them. Kale shook his head sadly. Sorry. Maybe try that warrior priest that Lukav is friends with. He clearly has considerable experience with soul magic and he sounds like he could help. In fact, the priesthood in general might be your best bet. They regularly go after people like Sudamir, and have both the qualified experts and the experience necessary for something like this. I'm pretty sure they won't just dismiss your claims out of hand. They take reports of necromancy very seriously, and your accusations should be easy to prove. Just teleport someone in the vicinity of Ayaska Mansion and let them see the evidence themselves. That's an interesting idea. I might actually try that in the next restart, if you really end up being unable to help me in any way, Zorian said. Though I'm worried about that escalating into something huge and attracting Red Robe's attention. Sudamir is connected to the invasion pretty tightly. I don't think the Abasins would stay secret for long if Ayaska Mansion came under attack like that. Honestly, that might actually be a good thing, Kale speculated. Red Robe thinks you are part of an army of time travelers out to get him, right? If so, it might actually be suspicious if you don't periodically do something big like that. Well, maybe, Zorian said. But it's still a huge hint to Red Robe, telling him where to look to find out more about his opposition. I feel it's too dangerous to expose myself to danger like that. After a while, they ran out of ideas to bounce back between each other and uncomfortable silence descended between them. Kale's inability to help much against Sudamir clearly kept eating away at him, gradually worsening his mood, and Zorian didn't know what to say to cheer him up. He doubted Kale even wanted to be cheered up. Eventually, Kale decided to simply cut their expedition short and asked Zorian to teleport them back home. The gathering trip was over. Monday came, and with it his meeting with Svim. Svim had never told Zorian when exactly he should drop by for their talk, so Zorian decided to come see him once his classes were over and he had no other obligations. Svim, as it turned out, had other ideas. The man ended up causing a small stir by barging into Zorian's first class of the day to pick him up, evidently impatient to talk to him. He had no idea whether this was a good or bad thing, and Svim refused to discuss anything until they were safely seated inside his office. So, Zorian asked, "What's your final verdict?" Instead of answering, Svim took a palm-sized stone orb out of his drawer and handed it to Zorian. "Channel some mana into this orb," Svim told him. The moment Zorian did so, the stone sphere lit up in a soft yellow glow. That was very familiar to Zorian. It reminded him of those basic training orbs they were given during their first year at the academy, the ones that helped students learn how to reliably channel their mana into the target. What was the point of making him do something like that again? Wait. Is this thing testing my mana signature? Zorian asked curiously. Yes, Svim confirmed. Everyone's personal mana is unique. You can hide or change your mana signature, but you cannot mimic someone else's to the best of my knowledge. The most you could do is trick the orb into giving a false positive, but I'd be able to tell if you were tampering with it in that fashion. It seems you really are who you claim you are, Mr. Kaczynski. I expected as much, but it would be sloppy not to check. First it was a lock keyed into my mana signature, and now this. How exactly did the Academy acquire my mana signature? I don't remember giving it at any point, said Zorian, handing the orb back to Svim. Every time you used one of these training orbs during your first year, said Svim, waving the stone orb in front of Zorian's face, you were effectively giving the Academy your mana signature. It was just a matter of locking the orb down to preserve it for future use. And that's legal? Zorian frowned. Svim nodded. Required by law, even. The government likes to have everyone's mana signatures on hand for investigations. It greatly simplifies a lot of identity disputes and the like. Right, Zorian sighed. So now that we've established I'm indeed Zorian Kaczynski. Yes, the time loop problem, Svim said, putting the orb back into his drawer. I assume you are aware of the prevalent opinion regarding time travel? Zorian nodded. They say it's impossible, he said. I know. But that's theory dash. And a lot of failed experiments, Svim interjected. And my personal experiences say otherwise, continued Zorian, ignoring Svim's interjection. Whatever prevalent opinion says, I can clearly see that time travel is possible. It's just a question of whether I've convinced you I'm telling the truth or not. You've convinced me there is something to your story, at least, Svim said. But I'm afraid I'm going to need more convincing before I actually accept the idea of a time loop. Do you think you could clarify some things for me? The next hour and a half consisted of Svim questioning Zorian about the rules that govern the time loop and the events surrounding it. The questioning was detailed enough that Svim probably realized Zorian was hiding some things from him, but the man never called him out on this. He also never wrote anything down, simply staring at Zorian and listening to his explanations in silence. It was honestly all a little unnerving. The material world has been cut off from the spiritual realms? Svim asked, raising an eyebrow at him. And you didn't feel this merited an inclusion in that list of things you gave me at the end of our Friday meeting? Well, what would that prove? Zorian defended himself. Nothing about that says specifically time travel. No, but it helps. Ameliorate one of the major issues that has been bothering me about this scenario, Svim said, staring at him. Namely, the incredible scale of the event you're describing. You've described the time loop as a cosmic phenomenon. It doesn't just wrench your soul into the past, it literally rolls back time for everything except you and your fellow time travelers. That's an implausible claim. The universe is very big and magic as we understand it has sharp limitations. But if the time loop had to cut off the material realm from the spiritual sphere to do its work, then that means it is somehow limited in scope, and that makes the whole thing a lot more believable to me. Did you speak to an astronomer to see if there were any irregularities in the stars and planetary orbits? No, Zorian frowned. Why do you think there would be irregularities? Because any responsible spell designer tries to minimize the costs of the spell, regardless of how much mana he has at his disposal, Svim told him. If I was in charge of building a spell that does what you describe, I wouldn't have bothered extending the effect beyond what I absolutely had to. Why burn resources unnecessarily? No one has ever set foot on the other planets, much less the distant stars. You could simply replace the heavens with an illusionary screen and be done with it. Most people would never know the difference. But astronomers might, Zorian guessed. Yes. Especially if the spell originates from the time of the first Icosian emperor like you said it might. There were no telescopes back then, and even professional starwatchers relied on their eyes to note the changes in the heavens. An illusion good enough to fool them might not be enough to do the same today, Svim said. I guess it's worth a try, Zorian said dubiously. Though I'm honestly kind of skeptical that we'll go anywhere. I'm pretty sure you can't just isolate our planet from the rest of the celestial bodies without breaking everything horribly and killing us all in the process. There has to be a limit somewhere, Svim said. I'll talk to the couple of astronomers I know and see what they tell me. In the meantime, make a note somewhere to include the spirit world severance factoid in your list the next time you try to convince me that the time loop is real. It should do wonders for your credibility. Also, make sure to sign the list with this. Svim took out a slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to him. Written on it in neat, perfect writing was a long string of letters and numbers. The whole thing was completely random and nonsensical as far as Zorian could tell. Some kind of coded message? Zorian mused out loud. Something similar. I've made a lot of contingencies over the years, including ones for when I expect to have my memories edited against my will and want to send messages to my future self, Svim said, surprising Zorian. That was quite paranoid. And also a good idea. He should probably make his own version of that. You will have to memorize the whole thing perfectly for this to work. If even a single number or letter is out of place, the whole thing is ruined. Zorian took several seconds to commit the code to his memory and then immediately created a memory packet around it, permanently preserving it for flawless recall in the future. Done, he said, handing the slip of paper back to Svim. What now? Based on the various adventure novels Zorian had read as a child, he kind of expected Svim to promptly burn the paper slip in his hand to prevent it from coming into the wrong hands. But no, Svim just put it back into his pocket and gave Zorian a searching look. Disappointing. That, Mr. Kaczynski, is something that I should be asking you, Svim said. I was originally worried that you might be an imposter and that you might have been editing my memories. Regardless of whether or not you really are a time traveler, you have effectively put those fears to rest. Truthfully, I have no right to demand anything more from you. What now, indeed? Well, you are technically my mentor and you're supposed to advise me about how to develop my magic, Zorian tried, hoping that Svim would actually do his job properly for once. He was curious how Svim's teaching looked when he was not putting his charges through some messed up dedication test. Unfortunately, this is probably not the best time for that. I would need to thoroughly test your skills to see how I can best help you, and I've kept you away from your morning classes for too long as it is, said Svim. I should have something ready for you when we meet again on Friday. Not another batch of shaping exercises, I hope. Zorian couldn't help but asking. No, Svim said, smiling slightly at the question. While I definitely intend to correct any obvious deficiencies in your magic base and raise your shaping skills to acceptable levels, I'm actually thinking of advancing your dimensionalism studies as far as they can go. That is, after all, the magical field that deals with things like time manipulation, which makes it uniquely relevant to your situation. It is a hard and demanding field of study, but if you could endure several years of my trials and keep coming, you doubtlessly have the required patience to succeed at it. Ha! That actually sounded kind of nice. The first part sounded a little ominous, but he would reserve judgment until he actually saw what that entailed in practice. He didn't actually mind the idea of being taught some shaping exercises, so long as Svim didn't resort to the same frustrating grind that he had employed in the past, and actually explained to Zorian how he was supposed to go about performing the exercise. In any case, the meeting was very much finished at this point, so Zorian said his goodbyes and left Svim's office. It was probably the first time he had ever left that place feeling better than he had when he entered it. Over the next few days, the after effect of Zorian's failed campaign against the burning apex web gradually faded away, leaving him completely healed. Kale was still poring over his necromancy books and tinkering with some kind of spell item he was building, and refused to talk to Zorian about Sudamir. He claimed he was pursuing a lead and that he would discuss things with him when he was ready. Zorian had a feeling that Kale was a little annoyed with him over his handling of the soul trap reveal, but he really couldn't think of what he could have done so much better. Maybe Kale didn't like that Zorian had waited so long to break the news to him. On the other hand, Taven had reacted much better when he had told her about the time loop this time. She was a lot more receptive to the idea if he didn't wait for her to have a breakdown before telling her. All in all, the recovery period was a bit boring and Zorian found himself searching for something to pass the time with. Just for fun, he recreated Curiel's drawings that he had stored in his mind and showed them to her. She frowned a lot while inspecting them, especially at the ones that clearly depicted the interior of Amaya's house and its inhabitants, but she did not seem willing to claim them as her own work. Instead, she criticized the technique of whoever drew them and suggested improvement, which amused him. She then asked him where he got them, and was annoyed at him when he insisted that he conjured them fully formed out of his head, which was also amusing. Somehow, the resulting argument led to Curiel giving him an impromptu drawing lesson and Zorian was bored enough at the time to go along with it. According to Curiel, he was actually decent at drawing, which surprised him. She even claimed he could get as good as she was if he was willing to work on it. Considering how swamped with everything he always was, he doubted he would ever find the time for something like that. Then again, perhaps he could use an actual hobby. It was during one of those slow days that Zorian went to the Academy library in search of a book that talked about Eldamar's internal politics. Partly because he couldn't shake off the feeling that Sudamir's offhand comment about how he was working with the invaders because of politics wasn't completely false, and partly because his recent musings about House Reed made him realize just how rudimentary his knowledge about Eldamar's power structures really was. He doubted he would really find an answer as to what Sudamir was referring to, but it probably wouldn't hurt to educate himself a little on the issue. In theory, Eldamar's internal situation was relatively simple. The country was a monarchy, with the power of the crown kept in check by a council of elders, a gathering of nobles that were ostensibly supposed to advise the monarch and help them govern the country efficiently. The seats were hereditary, each held by a different noble house. That was why they were noble, they had a seat on the council of elders, and were thus involved in the direct governing of the country. A regular house, while usually afforded a fair amount of special privileges and autonomy, did not have a say in how the country as a whole was run. Of course, reality was far more convoluted than that. The crown and the council of elders clashed all the time, the houses routinely overstepped their bounds if they thought they could get away with it. Organizations like the Mage Guild and the Holy Triumvirate Church wielded considerable influence of their own, and powerful independent actors tried to play all sides for their own benefit. And that was not even getting into the issue of semi-autonomous entities like the Shifter tribes or the Free Port of Luja. Basically, the matter was complicated and Zorian's initiative didn't accomplish all that much. He was just about to give up and go home when he stumbled upon Tinami. Or rather, she stumbled upon him. He was stationary, with his back turned to her, and the only reason he knew she was there was that he could recognize her mind through long exposure to her during previous restarts. He was content to ignore her at first, pretending he didn't know she was there, but since she was sufficiently curious to look over his shoulder to see what he was reading, he decided to say hello in the end. "Hello, Tinami," he said, not bothering to turn around. She immediately jerked back in surprise at the words. Ha! Surprise successful. Taking care to wipe the smile off his face, Zorian turned around to face the girl. It was only polite to look at someone when you were talking to them, after all. "Is there something I can help you with?" No, sorry," she said, stumbling for a moment but recovering her composure quickly. "I was just curious about what you were reading. And I just have to ask, Splinter of Splinters." "Really, Zorian? That's kind of." She paused for a moment, clearly searching for a polite term to use. "Why would you ever read such trash?" she finished eventually. Zorian looked at the book in his hands. He hadn't noticed anything too bad in the book thus far, though admittedly he wouldn't call it good either. Frankly, the only reason he was idly reading through it was because one of the other books he had already read and liked listed it among its sources. "I'm trying to find out an answer to a political question, but I know very little about politics," Zorian answered honestly. "So I'm mostly just reading things at random, leafing through whatever book catches my attention." He placed Splinter of Splinters back on the shelf. The book was boring as hell anyway. "What kind of topic are you looking for?" Tinami asked him. "I'm trying to find out a political reason why someone would want to burn Saioria to the ground," Zorian told her bluntly. "Hypothetically speaking, of course. Are we talking about external or internal forces?" Tinami asked, completely unperturbed by his admission. "Internal," Zorian clarified. "I'm pretty sure the number of external enemies that want the same is numberless." "Not really, no," Tinami said. "Saioria supplies critical products to the entire continent. I think only Solonon and a handful of others would be glad to see it completely gone." "What about Ulquin Ibesa?" asked Zorian curiously. "Them?" Tinami scoffed. "Who cares what they want? They can't do anything to us except raid our shipping. And as long as Eldamar controls Fort Oriclo, even that is just a minor nuisance." Zorian hummed noncommittedly. He couldn't really fault Tinami for that logic, since he would have likely said something similar before he had experienced the invasion and found out who was behind it. "Fair enough," he said. "So what I'm getting from all of this is that you know a thing or two about politics, yes?" "I am an heir of one of the noble houses," Tinami shrugged. "I'm required to know this sort of stuff. So yes, I suppose I do." "Excellent. Then, do you think you can recommend me a book about Eldamar's internal politics that isn't trash, as you say?" he asked her. He expected her to either say no or give him a title or two to look for. What he did not expect was for her to drag him across the library for over 15 minutes in search of something that met his exact criteria. By the time Tinami was done suggesting things to him, he'd ended up with 3 different books, one of which was a huge scary tome that made Zorian sleepy just looking at it. He was starting to think he had made just a tiny bit of a mistake when he had asked her for help in this matter. "Sorry, I went a little overboard," Tinami apologized, sounding honestly apologetic. "It's fine," Zorian sighed. "Though I'll be honest with you, I really doubt I'm going to read all of this." He shook the stack of books in his hands for emphasis. "If you must pick one of the 3 to read, read Time of Tribulations," Tinami told him. "Oh good, that wasn't the big one. That's the important one. The Splinter Wars and the Weeping completely rearranged the political landscape everywhere in Altazia, but especially in Eldamar. Without understanding what aftershocks they caused and how countries dealt with them, you will never really understand Eldamar's politics." "I see," Zorian said quietly. That did make a lot of sense. The Splinter Wars essentially created Eldamar in its current form, and the Weeping actually originated from Eldamar. Nobody at the time realized just how dangerous it was, in the early days of its spread, so it had significant effects on the country. It would be surprising if those 2 events hadn't changed things greatly. I guess it has something to do with the significant death toll of mages those two caused. Sort of, Tinami said. It has to do with replacing them. Before the Splinter Wars, far more mages belonged to an established house or had at least one mage parent. First-generation mages like yourself were not rare exactly, but far less common than they are now. After the Splinter Wars and the Weeping, though, a lot of those houses and families went extinct or bankrupt, unable to deal with the chaos of the times or the loss of critical members. The last thing Eldamar wanted to do was downscale their operations due to lack of mages, so somebody had to replace the dead. The result was a lot of first-generation mages flooding the magical market in previously unseen numbers. So? Zorian asked. I guess I'm a little biased, being a civilian-born student myself, but why is that a problem? Not a problem as such, no, Tinami said carefully. But it definitely changed the politics of the country beyond recognition. First-generation mages are educated and supported by the Mage Guild, and by extension the Crown of Eldamar. When houses and other autonomous groups clash with the Crown, first-generation mages overwhelmingly side with the Crown. The influx of civilian-born mages helped Eldamar bounce back from the Splinter Wars and Weeping incredibly quickly, but it also strengthened royal power and made the Mage Guild far more important than it used to be, and that scares a lot of factions. Interesting, Zorian hummed thoughtfully. How does that relate to Scioria and people who want to see it burn, though? Well, Scioria is absolutely critical for first-generation mages who want to make it big, Tinami said. Most other mana wells have sharp limits on the amount of mana they produce, and thus have tight regulations about who can perform what magical business in the area. They're usually controlled by some established group or even a house, and aren't very friendly to newcomers unless they're willing to become someone's underlings. The whole, on the other hand, spews incomprehensibly vast amounts of mana into the air every single second. Far more than anyone could really use up. There is never a shortage of ambient mana in Scioria, so nobody cares about how many mana forges, research facilities and various other facilities are built in the city. Unsurprisingly, the city is absolutely flooded with first-generation mages, which makes it a major loyalist stronghold. It's so important to the central government, politically speaking, that some people call it the second national capital. Anyone who has an axe to grind against either the Crown or the Mage Guild might want to see it gone. Though I rather suspect that anyone expressing the desire to see it literally burned to the ground is just being overdramatic. Our external political situation is sufficiently dangerous that no one really wants to weaken the nation too much, and Scioria is both a major population center and a magical powerhouse. So, what I'm getting from your explanation is that people who most want to see Scioria gone probably come from various houses that dislike their historical importance being eroded, Zorian said. Sadly, that didn't explain Sudamir's remark. As far as Zorian could tell, he had no idea whether Sudamir was a first-generation mage, but he definitely wasn't a part of a house. But the thing is, there are plenty of houses, even noble houses who have their headquarters stationed here. Yours, for example. Or House Novita. Not every house likes every other, Tinami shrugged. There are plenty of them that would hold a celebration if every Aope spontaneously died in their sleep. Ouch. But it's funny you would mention the Novitas. You know what happened to them, right? They all died except Zack, Zorian said immediately. Yes, and then the Crown placed Tezin's as Zack's caretaker, and he sold off nearly everything they owned to his friends and associates for pocket change while paying himself a huge caretaker fee. Few people will outright say so, but the man basically looted the entire house of everything they had. And the Novita were very, very wealthy, Tinami explained. If Zack wasn't such an idiot, I'd imagine he'd be extremely bitter about the city authorities that were complicit in the deed. I could totally imagine myself wishing for Scioria to burn down to ashes, if I were in his place. At least on an emotional level. Ha! You know, Zorian said. I think I want to hear more about that story.